Nobody is flying today because my daughters aren't flying today. Those 9 words spoken through a satellite phone in the suffocating heat of JFK Terminal 4 would ground every single aircraft on the East Coast and cost the aviation industry $47 million in a single afternoon. But before we get to that moment of corporate reckoning, before we witness 2 teenage girls bring an entire airport to its knees with nothing but dignity and a phone number, we need to understand how a routine Tuesday morning at one of the world's busiest airports became the day that changed everything. The alarm in the Beaumont estate hadn't sounded yet, but Vincent Beaumont was already awake, standing in his home office overlooking the Hudson River, reviewing the overnight reports from Chimera Energy Group's operations across 3 continents. At 52, Vincent had built his company from a single fuel truck in Newark into the largest aviation energy supplier in North America. But this morning, his mind wasn't on quarterly projections or supply chain logistics. Today, his twin daughters were flying to London alone for the first time, taking their 10-year-old brother with them. And despite all his success and influence, Vincent felt the familiar knot of protective anxiety that every parent knows. Aria and Zara were 19 now, brilliant young women who had inherited not just his business acumen but his unwavering sense of justice. Yet he still saw them as the little girls who used to fall asleep in his office while he worked late into the night. "Daddy, are you worried about us?" Kai Beaumont appeared in the doorway, his small frame dwarfed by the massive mahogany door frame, clutching the leather journal that went everywhere with him, a habit Vincent had encouraged since the boy learned to write. At 10 years old, Kai possessed that rare combination of childhood innocence and unsettling perceptiveness that made adults forget he was listening until he asked a question that cut straight to the truth. Vincent turned from the window and smiled at his youngest child, the boy who had become the heart of their family after Charlotte's death 7 years ago. "Not worried, little man, just making sure everything is perfect for your trip." He knelt down to Kai's eye level, a gesture that had become second nature over the years. "You remember what I taught you about documentation, right?" Kai held up his journal proudly. "Write down what people say. Write down what people do and ask questions when something doesn't feel right." He paused, his dark eyes serious beyond his years. "But Daddy, what if people don't want to answer my questions?" "Then you keep asking until they do, or until someone who can answer shows up," Vincent replied, ruffling his son's hair. It was a philosophy that had served him well in business, though he couldn't have imagined how crucial that lesson would become before the day was over. Down the hall, Aria and Zara were engaged in the familiar choreography of packing that only twins who had shared everything for 19 years could execute. Their bedroom looked like a hurricane had passed through, but somehow they both knew exactly where everything was supposed to go. Aria older by 12 minutes and never letting Zara forget it was meticulously organizing business documents for their London meetings with European energy investors who were interested in Chimera's clean aviation fuel initiative. "Do you think they'll take us seriously?" Zara asked, holding up 2 identical blazers, trying to decide which one looked more professional. Despite her confident exterior, she still struggled with the reality of being a young black woman in boardrooms full of older white men who often seemed surprised by her presence. Aria paused in her packing, understanding the deeper question her sister was asking. "They'll have to take us seriously because we own something they need and we know our business better than anyone else in that room." She walked over and took both blazers from Zara's hand, setting them aside. "Besides, if they don't, we'll just do what Daddy taught us to do." Which is what Zara asked, though she already knew the answer. "We remember who we are and we act accordingly," they said in unison, laughing at their synchronized response. It was Vincent's favorite saying, one that had guided the family through countless challenges over the years. The Beaumont family had built their fortune through a combination of brilliant strategy, relentless work ethic, and an unshakable belief that respect was earned through competence, not demanded through intimidation. Vincent had started Chimera Energy with nothing but a loan from his late wife Charlotte's father and a revolutionary idea about fuel efficiency that the major oil companies had dismissed as impossible. 25 years later, Chimera supplied jet fuel to over 60% of commercial aviation on the East Coast, and Vincent had never forgotten that his success was built on the foundation of people underestimating him because he didn't look like what they expected a CEO to look like. Power without compassion is just destruction waiting to happen. He had told his children countless times, and they had watched him live that philosophy every day, treating his employees with dignity, regardless of their position, supporting community initiatives that lifted up the next generation of minority entrepreneurs, and never using his wealth or influence to hurt people who had less power than he did. As the family gathered for breakfast, there was an excitement in the air that had nothing to do with private jets or first-class accommodations. For Vincent, watching his daughters step into their roles as the next generation of Beaumont leaders was worth more than any contract or acquisition. For Aria and Zara, this trip represented everything they had been working toward since they were old enough to understand what their father had built and what their responsibility to that legacy meant. And for Kai, who had been documenting family conversations and business discussions in his journal for years, this was his first real adventure as an official member of the Beaumont team, even if his primary job was to observe, learn, and ask the questions that adults sometimes forgot to ask. None of them had any idea that before the sun set, Kai's innocent questions would expose the ugly truth about prejudice in corporate America. His documentation would become evidence in a federal investigation, and the family's unified response to injustice would reshape an entire industry's approach to customer dignity. The black SUV pulled up to JFK Terminal 4 at exactly 9:15 in the morning, and Vincent stepped out first, automatically scanning the area the way successful people who had received occasional threats learned to do. The July heat was already building, promising another scorching day in New York, but the real heat would come from what happened inside the terminal. Aria and Zara emerged from the vehicle looking like the successful young executives they were, but their choice of clothing was deliberately casual. Both wore matching beige hoodies from their favorite designer dark jeans and expensive sneakers that looked comfortable but cost more than most people's monthly salary. Their hair was pulled back in elegant ponytails, and their makeup was subtle but perfect. They had learned from their father that real power didn't need to announce itself with formal clothes and flashy jewelry, though anyone with a trained eye could see the quality of everything they wore. Kai bounded out of the car with the limitless energy of a 10-year-old who was about to fly across the ocean, his small backpack bouncing as he moved. His outfit matched his sister's casual elegance, and his journal was tucked safely in his front pocket, where he could reach it quickly. He had been asking Vincent questions about London for weeks, and his excitement was infectious. "Remember, girls," Vincent said as the driver unloaded their luggage. "This isn't just about the meetings. The real education happens in how people treat you when they think you're nobody special." He pulled each of his daughters into a hug, holding them a moment longer than usual. "And Kai, your job is to see everything and question everything, just like we practiced." The family had made a conscious decision to travel without the usual entourage that accompanied most CEO families. No bodyguards, no assistants, no obvious signs of wealth, except for the quality of their belongings and the confidence in their bearing. Vincent believed that his children needed to experience the world as it really was, not filtered through layers of protection that would leave them unprepared for reality. "Daddy, what time is your flight?" Kai asked, practicing the time zone calculations they had worked on together. "I leave at 6 tonight, so I'll be in London by the time you wake up tomorrow," Vincent replied, checking his watch. "You'll have the whole afternoon to explore before I get there." As they walked through the automatic doors into Terminal 4, the familiar chaos of one of the world's busiest airports enveloped them. Thousands of travelers moved through the vast space with practiced efficiency, rolling luggage, clicking against polished floors, departure announcements echoing from overhead speakers and the constant background hum of air conditioning working overtime against the summer heat. Arya pulled out her phone to check their flight status while Zara organized their boarding passes, but Kai was already observing the people around them with the focused attention of a child who had been taught to see patterns and notice details. He watched how the airline staff interacted with different passengers, how security personnel made decisions about who to screen more carefully, and how other travelers responded to their family's presence. "Arya, look," Kai said quietly, tugging on his sister's hoodie sleeve. "That lady at the information desk was really nice to the man in the suit, but she barely looked at the woman with the baby who asked the same question." Arya followed her brother's gaze and saw exactly what he had noticed. It was a small thing, easily missed if you weren't paying attention, but it was the kind of subtle discrimination that the Beaumont children had been trained to recognize. Their father had taught them that prejudice rarely announced itself with obvious cruelty. More often it revealed itself through tiny moments of difference in treatment tone and attention. "Good eye, little brother," Zara said, making a mental note of the interaction. "What do you think that means?" Kai considered the question seriously the way he always did when his sisters asked for his opinion. "I think maybe people decide how nice to be based on what someone looks like instead of just being nice to everyone." It was a profound observation delivered with the straightforward clarity that only children possess, and both sisters felt a familiar surge of pride in their little brother's developing sense of justice. Vincent had raised them to understand that awareness was the first step toward change, but they had no idea how relevant that lesson was about to become. The family made their way through the terminal toward the Skyline Airlines first-class check-in area, passing shops selling overpriced snacks and souvenirs, gate areas packed with travelers waiting for delayed flights, and the endless parade of humanity that defined modern air travel. They moved with the easy confidence of experienced travelers, but also with the unconscious wariness of a black family in spaces where they knew they might not be immediately welcomed. As they approached the first-class check-in zone marked off with velvet ropes and staffed by agents who were supposed to provide premium service to the airline's most valuable customers, Kai noticed something else that caught his attention. Zara. "Why is that man in line looking at us like that?" he asked, nodding toward a middle-aged passenger who was staring at their family with obvious disapproval. Zara glanced over and saw the expression Kai had noticed. It was a look she and Arya had encountered countless times over the years, a mixture of suspicion and resentment that some people couldn't hide when they saw young black people in spaces they considered exclusive. "Some people make assumptions about where we belong, Kai. They think certain places are only for certain kinds of people." "But that's silly," Kai replied with the logic of childhood. "Daddy says airlines are businesses, and businesses want customers who can pay for their services. Why would they care what customers look like?" "They shouldn't care," Arya answered, pulling out her phone to double-check their boarding passes. "But sometimes people forget that businesses are supposed to serve everyone equally." As they joined the short line for first-class check-in, none of them realized they were walking into a confrontation that would test every principle Vincent had taught them about dignity, justice, and the responsible use of power. The two women staffing the premium counter had already noticed their approach, and judgments were being formed based on assumptions that would prove catastrophically wrong. Kai opened his journal and wrote down the time, the location, and his first observation of the day. People at airport treat different passengers different ways. Sisters say this is wrong. Want to understand why it happens. In less than 30 minutes, that journal would contain evidence that would change lives, destroy careers, and force an entire industry to confront the ugly truth about how prejudice operated in plain sight. Linda Morrison had been standing behind the Skyline Airlines first-class check-in counter for exactly 22 years, 4 months and 16 days, and she prided herself on knowing her job better than anyone else in Terminal 4. The plaque mounted beside her computer screen read, "Service Excellence Award 2018, a recognition she had earned through what she considered to be an unwavering commitment to protecting the integrity of the premium travel experience. At 54 years old, Linda had seen every scam, every sob story, and every attempt to game the airline industry's complex system of fees, upgrades, and elite status. She had developed what she thought of as a sixth sense for fraudulent travelers, people who tried to use fake boarding passes, expired vouchers, or elaborate social engineering to access services they hadn't paid for. In Linda's mind, this vigilance wasn't cruelty. It was professionalism. What Linda couldn't see or chose not to acknowledge was how her pattern of suspicion fell disproportionately on travelers who didn't match her mental image of what a first-class passenger should look like. Young people, families who didn't dress formally, anyone whose appearance suggested they might not have the financial resources for premium travel, became automatic subjects of extra scrutiny regardless of their actual ticket status. This morning, Linda was dealing with more stress than usual. Her 17-year-old son, Jake, had been struggling in school due to learning difficulties that required expensive specialized tutoring, and her ex-husband had been late with child support payments again. The financial pressure was constant, and Linda channeled her frustration into an even more rigid adherence to what she saw as the rules that kept order in her small corner of the aviation world. Standing beside Linda was Derek Walsh, the duty manager for the premium services desk. At 31 years old, Derek was ambitious, insecure, and desperate to prove himself worthy of the management position he had fought hard to obtain. As a first-generation college graduate whose father had worked construction and whose mother had cleaned office buildings, Derek felt like he was constantly performing a version of success he didn't quite understand, trying to fit into a corporate culture that still felt foreign to him. Derek's insecurity manifested as an overcompensation in authority, a tendency to assert control in situations where collaboration would have been more appropriate. He had learned that in corporate America, admitting uncertainty was often seen as weakness, so he had trained himself to project confidence even when he wasn't sure what was happening. This morning, that tendency would prove disastrous. "Linda, heads up," Derek said, nodding toward the approaching Beaumont family. "Looks like we might have some buddy pass travelers trying to jump the line." Linda looked up from her computer screen and evaluated the family with the practiced eye of someone who had made thousands of split-second judgments about passenger legitimacy. She saw 3 young black people in casual clothing approaching the first-class counter, and every alarm bell in her head started ringing. In her experience, people who looked like this family usually belonged in the economy check-in area, not the premium service zone. "I've got this," Linda said to Derek, straightening her posture and preparing to redirect what she assumed would be confused or opportunistic travelers to the appropriate area. She had performed this routine hundreds of times before, and she felt confident in her ability to handle the situation with professional courtesy while maintaining the boundaries that kept her operation running smoothly. What Linda didn't know, couldn't have known from her position behind the counter, was that she was about to confront the family that literally owned the fuel in the aircraft engines parked outside her window. She didn't know that Aria and Zara Beaumont were traveling to London to negotiate a deal that would affect energy supplies across 2 continents. She didn't know that Kai Beaumont had been trained to document discriminatory treatment as part of his education in social justice. Most importantly, Linda had no idea that Vincent Beaumont was the kind of man who had built his fortune while never forgetting what it felt like to be underestimated, dismissed, or treated as less than human because of his race. She didn't know that Vincent had taught his children to give people opportunities to correct their mistakes, but also to never allow dignity to be treated as negotiable. Derek checked his watch, noting the growing line of passengers behind the Beaumont family. In his mind, efficient customer flow was the key to operational success, and any disruption to that flow needed to be managed quickly and decisively. He had been trained to think of passenger processing as a logistical challenge, rather than a series of human interactions, and that training had stripped away much of his natural empathy. "Morning rush is going to be heavy today," Derek commented to Linda, pulling up passenger manifests on his tablet. Corporate wants us to maintain our efficiency metrics while still providing premium service. Linda nodded, understanding the implicit pressure to move customers through quickly without creating the kind of negative experiences that generated complaint letters or social media criticism. What she failed to grasp was that true efficiency came from getting things right the first time, not from making assumptions that would later prove catastrophically wrong. As the Beaumont family reached the counter, Linda put on her professional smile, the expression she had perfected over 2 decades of customer service. It was friendly, but cautious, welcoming, but ready to become firm if necessary. She had no idea that in the next few minutes that smile would transform into something else entirely, and that the casual dismissal she was preparing to deliver would trigger a chain of events that would destroy her career and change her life forever. Derek positioned himself slightly behind Linda, ready to step in if the situation required managerial intervention. He was thinking about his afternoon meetings, his weekend plans, and the performance review that was coming up in 2 weeks. He was not thinking about the possibility that his next decision could ground every aircraft on the East Coast and turn him into a cautionary tale about the dangers of prejudice in corporate America. In her purse behind the counter, Linda's phone buzzed with a text message from Jake's tutor, reminding her that this month's payment was overdue. The financial stress she was carrying would make her more defensive than usual, more likely to see threats where none existed, and more determined to assert control over the situation developing in front of her. Neither Linda nor Derek had any idea that they were about to become central figures in a story that would be viewed millions of times, discussed in corporate boardrooms across the country, and used as a case study in business schools for years to come. Aria approached the first-class check-in counter with the quiet confidence that came from years of traveling for business, her boarding pass ready in her hand and a polite smile on her face. Beside her, Zara carried their shared documentation folder, and Kai walked slightly behind them, his journal already out as he prepared to observe another interaction between his family and the service industry. "Good morning," Aria said warmly, placing her phone on the counter with their digital boarding passes displayed clearly on the screen. "We're checking in for Flight 447 to London. The Beaumont party, 3 passengers." Linda looked at the phone screen but didn't reach for it, didn't lean forward to examine the confirmation numbers, and didn't access her computer system to verify the booking. Instead, she looked past Aria to the line of passengers forming behind the family, calculating in her mind how many legitimate first-class customers would be delayed by whatever scam she was certain she was about to uncover. "I'm sorry, but the first-class check-in is for premium passengers only," Linda said, her tone shifting from professional courtesy to barely concealed impatience. "Economy and basic economy check-in is located at the far end of the terminal past security. You'll need to go there for standby processing." Kai looked up from his journal, his young face showing genuine confusion at Linda's response. "Excuse me, Miss Linda," he said, reading her name tag carefully, "but my sisters have first-class tickets. Why can't you help them here?" Linda's eyes shifted to Kai, and for a moment she felt a flicker of uncertainty. Children didn't usually participate in elaborate fraud schemes, and his question was so direct and innocent that it momentarily disrupted her assumptions about what was happening. "Look, sweetie," Linda said, her voice taking on the patronizing tone adults sometimes used with children they wanted to dismiss. "I'm sure your sisters think they have first-class tickets, but sometimes there are mistakes or misunderstandings about what kind of tickets people actually purchased." Zara stepped forward, holding out a printed confirmation that showed their full itinerary seat assignments and VIP status indicators. "There's no misunderstanding," she said calmly. "We have seats 1A, 1B, and 1C. Our confirmation numbers are clearly printed here, and our boarding passes are loaded in the airline's official mobile app." Derek noticed the growing tension and moved closer to the counter, his manager instincts telling him that Linda might need backup. He glanced at the printed confirmation Zara was holding, but didn't take the time to read it carefully. In his experience, fraudulent documents could look very convincing, and he had learned to trust Linda's judgment about passenger legitimacy. "Ladies," Derek said, stepping up beside Linda with the authority of his management position, "I understand you believe you have valid reservations, but we process dozens of fraudulent bookings every day. People use fake confirmation numbers, photoshopped boarding passes, and stolen credit card information to try to access services they haven't paid for." Kai started writing in his journal, documenting the exact words Derek had used and noting the time of the interaction. His handwriting was careful and neat, the result of years of practice in recording important conversations for later discussion with his father. Mr. Derek, Kai said again, reading the name tag to ensure accuracy. "Why don't you just check their tickets on your computer? Daddy says that when there's a question about something, the best thing to do is look for the facts." Derek felt a moment of irritation at being questioned by a child, and his response was sharper than it needed to be. "Son, this is grown-up business, and there are procedures we have to follow to protect all of our customers from fraud. Sometimes those procedures might not make sense to someone your age." Arya maintained her composure, but her voice carried a new edge when she spoke again. "Mr. Walsh, we're not asking you to skip procedures. We're asking you to follow them. Check our booking. Verify our payment. Confirm our seat assignments. That's literally what this counter is for." Linda's frustration was building as the line behind the Beaumont family grew longer and other passengers began to show signs of impatience. She could see several legitimate first-class passengers checking their watches and looking annoyed at the delay, and her priority was maintaining efficiency in her operation. "I don't need to check anything to know that you're in the wrong place," Linda said, her professional mask finally slipping completely. "I've been doing this job for over 20 years, and I can tell when people belong in first class and when they don't. You three clearly don't belong here." The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud, and Kai looked up from his journal with wide eyes. Even at 10 years old, he understood that Linda had just said something that went far beyond standard customer service procedures. She hadn't questioned their tickets or their payment. She had questioned their worth as human beings. Linda, Kai asked, his voice still innocent but carrying a new weight. "What do you think first-class passengers are supposed to look like?" It was a simple question delivered without malice or accusation, but it cut straight to the heart of Linda's prejudice, in a way that left her speechless for several seconds. In that moment of silence, Zara pulled out her phone and began recording the interaction, understanding that they had crossed a line from poor customer service into something much more serious. Derek realized that the situation was spiraling out of control, but instead of de-escalating by simply checking the family's reservation, he doubled down on his authority. "Recording is not permitted in this area," he said, reaching toward Zara's phone. "You need to stop filming and move to the appropriate check-in area immediately." "Actually," Arya said, her voice now carrying the cold precision of someone who had been raised in boardrooms, "recording in public areas of airports is completely legal, and refusing to verify our legitimate booking while treating us differently than other customers is a violation of federal transportation anti-discrimination laws." For the first time since the interaction began, Derek felt a chill of genuine concern. Arya's knowledge of legal regulations and her confident delivery suggested that this family might not be as powerless as he had assumed, but his pride prevented him from backing down. The moment had arrived when a simple computer check could have resolved everything, when an apology could have restored dignity, and when professional behavior could have prevented a disaster. Instead, Derek made the decision that would destroy his career and change his life forever. "You know what," Derek said, walking around the counter to face the family directly. "I don't think you have any tickets at all." The check-in area fell into an uncomfortable silence as Derek's accusation echoed through the space, and every passenger within earshot turned to watch the confrontation unfold. Social media had trained people to recognize potentially viral moments, and several phones were now recording the scene from different angles as the situation deteriorated beyond any reasonable customer service protocol. Kai continued writing in his journal, but his hand was moving faster now, trying to capture not just the words being spoken, but the emotional atmosphere that was building around his family. At 10 years old, he had limited experience with this kind of adult hostility, but his father had prepared him for the possibility that people might treat their family unfairly because of their race. Write down everything. Ask questions about anything that doesn't seem right, and remember that you have every right to be treated with dignity, Vincent had taught him. Now Kai was putting that training into practice in real time, documenting what would become crucial evidence in the federal investigation that followed. Derek, I'm going to ask you one more time to check our reservation, Zara said, her voice steady despite the growing crowd of onlookers. Our booking confirmation number is GB4771X. Our frequent flyer number is registered under Beaumont, and our tickets were purchased 6 weeks ago through the Skyline Airlines Platinum Customer Portal. Derek looked at Linda, who shook her head slightly, indicating that she still believed they were dealing with fraudulent travelers, attempting to intimidate their way into premium services. The assumption was so deeply embedded in their minds that contrary evidence felt like manipulation rather than truth. I've heard every story and seen every fake confirmation number, Derek said, his voice rising slightly. Sophisticated scammers research actual flight numbers, generate realistic-looking confirmation codes, and use confident behavior to try to overwhelm airline staff into making mistakes. A businessman in an expensive suit who had been waiting in line behind the Beaumont family cleared his throat loudly, making his impatience known. Excuse me, are we going to resolve this sometime today? I have a connection to make in London. Derek looked at the businessman, then back at the family, feeling pressure from multiple directions. His training told him to maintain control of the situation, but the tools he had been given for maintaining control were inadequate for dealing with customers who refused to be intimidated or dismissed. Sir, we'll have you processed in just a moment, Derek told the businessman. We're dealing with a security issue that requires proper verification. Kai looked up from his journal again, his young voice cutting through the tension with startling clarity. Mr. Derek, what security issue? My sisters just want to check in for their flight. Why is that a security problem? The question exposed the fundamental flaw in Derek's logic, and several passengers in the growing crowd began to murmur among themselves, recognizing that the airline staff's behavior didn't match the supposed threat they were addressing. Linda felt the situation slipping away from her control and made the decision to escalate rather than admit error. Derek, I think we need to call airport security. These individuals are disrupting operations and refusing to follow directions. Arya exchanged a look with Zara, both sisters recognizing that they had reached a point where calm reasoning was no longer going to resolve the situation. They had given Derek and Linda multiple opportunities to simply verify their booking, and those opportunities had been rejected in favor of assumptions based on their appearance. Before you call security, Arya said, pulling out her phone again, let me ask you something. Do you understand what happens when airline employees are found to have engaged in racial discrimination against passengers? Derek's confidence wavered slightly at the directness of the question, but he had invested too much authority in his position to back down now. This isn't about race, he said, though his voice lacked conviction. This is about following proper procedures to prevent fraud. Then follow the procedures, Zara responded immediately. Check our booking, verify our payment, confirm our seat assignments. Those are your procedures and you're refusing to use them. The crowd of onlookers was growing larger and someone in the back called out, just check their tickets, which prompted a murmur of agreement from other passengers who were beginning to understand that they were witnessing discrimination rather than fraud prevention. Kai raised his hand like he was in school, drawing attention from everyone around the counter. Excuse me, can I ask everyone a question? His innocent demeanor and small stature made it impossible for the adults to ignore him. What's your question, sweetheart? Asked an elderly woman who was waiting with her husband for first-class check-in. "Do you think my sisters look like criminals?" Kai asked, his voice carrying across the entire check-in area. "Because Mr. Derek and Miss Linda are treating them like criminals, but they won't tell us what crime they think my sisters committed." The question hit the crowd like a physical blow, forcing everyone present to confront the obvious disparity between the family's polite behavior and the airline staff's hostile response. The silence that followed was heavy with recognition and discomfort. Derek realized that he was losing the crowd, and in his desperation to regain control, he made the decision that would transform a customer service dispute into a federal case. "I'm going to my computer right now to check this alleged reservation," he announced loudly. "And when I prove that these tickets are fraudulent, I'm calling the FBI." Arya pulled out her satellite phone, the same encrypted device she used for international business communications, and held it where Derek could see it. "That's fine," she said calmly. "While you're doing that, I'm going to call my father and let him know that Skyline Airlines is refusing to honor our confirmed reservation." Derek laughed, a sound that carried no humor. "Call whoever you want. Your father can't change the fact that you're trying to board a flight with fake tickets." As Derek walked toward his computer terminal, Kai tugged on Arya's hoodie and whispered, "Should we tell them who Daddy is?" Arya looked down at her little brother, seeing the confusion and hurt in his eyes, and made the decision that would change everything. "In about 2 minutes, little brother, they're going to figure it out for themselves." Derek approached his computer terminal with the swagger of a man who believed he was about to prove a point that would vindicate his authority and expose what he saw as an elaborate deception. He cracked his knuckles dramatically, playing to the crowd of passengers who were watching his every move, confident that the next few keystrokes would reveal the fraudulent booking he was certain he would find. "All right, let's see what we're really dealing with here," Derek announced, his voice carrying the theatrical authority of someone who had watched too many police procedural shows. "Booking confirmation, GB 4771X under the name Beaumont." He typed the information into the system, and what appeared on his screen made his confident expression freeze completely. The booking was not only legitimate, it was flagged with VIP status indicators that Derek had rarely seen in his entire career. The ticket class showed F for first class, the payment status showed paid in full, and the customer profile showed a history of premium bookings dating back several years. But what made Derek's blood run cold was the notation attached to the passenger profile, Chimera Energy Executive Family. "Do not downgrade. Priority handling." Derek stared at the screen, reading the notation 3 times to make sure he wasn't misunderstanding what he was seeing. Chimera Energy Group was one of Skyline Airlines' most important strategic partners, providing jet fuel for the majority of their fleet operations. Derek knew enough about the airline industry to understand that fuel suppliers held enormous power over carriers, and that Chimera, in particular, had a reputation for demanding excellence from their business partners. For several long seconds, Derek stared at his computer screen in complete silence, his mind racing as he tried to figure out how to extract himself from the catastrophic mistake he was in the process of making. The professional thing to do would have been to immediately apologize, process the family's check-in, and hope that his earlier behavior would be forgotten or forgiven. Instead, Derek's pride and desperation led him to make a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Rather than admitting his error, he convinced himself that the VIP notation in the system must be part of an elaborate fraud scheme, possibly involving identity theft or corporate espionage. Linda Derek called out, his voice tight with false confidence. "Come look at this. These people have somehow managed to hack into our customer database and create fake VIP profiles." Linda hurried over to look at Derek's screen, and her face went pale as she saw the legitimate booking information displayed in front of her. Unlike Derek, she had enough experience with the airline's computer system to recognize that the VIP flags and payment confirmations she was seeing couldn't be faked through external means. "Derek," Linda whispered, "this looks real." The payment processing codes, the frequent flyer integration, the booking history. This is all generated by our internal systems. Derek's response revealed the depth of his commitment to his mistake. Then they've hacked deeper than we thought, he said loud enough for the surrounding passengers to hear. Corporate espionage, identity theft, possibly even terrorism-related infiltration of airline security systems. The words terrorism sent a ripple of alarm through the crowd, and Derek seemed to feed off the attention and concern he was generating. In his mind, he was no longer just a duty manager dealing with difficult customers. He was a security professional protecting innocent travelers from sophisticated criminals. Kai raised his hand again, his young voice cutting through Derek's increasingly frantic explanations. "Mr. Derek, if my sisters are criminals who hacked your computers, why are they standing here talking to you instead of running away?" It was another devastatingly simple question that exposed the logical flaws in Derek's conspiracy theory. But Derek was too far down the rabbit hole of his own creation to recognize the wisdom in a child's observation. "Sophisticated criminals often hide in plain sight," Derek replied, sounding like he was quoting from a security manual he had never actually read. "They use innocent family members, including children, to make their operations seem legitimate." Arya had been listening to Derek's increasingly unhinged theories with growing disbelief, but his suggestion that Kai was being used as a prop in some criminal enterprise triggered something in her that Vincent had always warned his daughters to keep under control. The protective instinct that ran through the Beaumont family was powerful and threatening. One member meant threatening them all. Derek, Arya said, her voice dropping to a tone that anyone who knew Vincent Beaumont would have recognized as dangerous. "You just accused my 10-year-old brother of being part of a terrorist conspiracy. I want you to think very carefully about your next words." Zara moved closer to Kai, placing a protective hand on his shoulder while continuing to record the entire interaction on her phone. The crowd of passengers had grown to include people from other check-in areas who had been drawn by the commotion, and the consensus among the observers was clearly shifting against Derek and Linda. "Ma'am, I understand you're upset," Derek said, trying to regain some semblance of professional authority, "but when airline security is potentially compromised, we have protocols that must be followed regardless of anyone's emotional reactions." The businessman who had been waiting in line finally reached his breaking point. "This is absolutely insane," he said loudly. "I've been standing here for 15 minutes watching you people refuse to check in 3 passengers who clearly have legitimate tickets. Either process their boarding passes or get a manager who can do your job competently." Derek felt the crowd turning against him completely, and in his desperation to maintain control of the narrative, he made the decision that would destroy his career and change his life forever. "Sir, I am the manager, and I'm telling you that these individuals are attempting to board an international flight using fraudulent documents. I have the authority to void their reservations and flag their identification in our security database." He turned back to his computer and began typing, his fingers moving rapidly across the keyboard as he accessed the reservation management system. On his screen, the Beaumont family's confirmed booking appeared with all of its legitimate payment confirmations and VIP status indicators. Derek clicked on the Modify Booking option, then selected Cancel Reservation from the drop-down menu. A warning dialogue appeared asking him to confirm the cancellation and provide a reason for the action. Reason for cancellation: suspected fraud and security risk. Derek typed, then clicked Confirm cancellation without hesitation. The computer processed his request, and within seconds, the Beaumont family's confirmed first-class reservations for Flight 447 to London disappeared from the airline's system entirely. The VIP flags vanished. The seat assignments were released back to inventory, and the payment confirmations were archived as part of a voided transaction. Derek turned away from his computer with the expression of grim satisfaction, believing that he had just prevented a serious security breach and protected his airline from sophisticated criminals. He had no idea that he had just fired the first shot in a corporate war that would cost his company millions of dollars and destroy his own future in the process. "Ladies and gentlemen," Derek announced to the crowd, "I have just canceled these fraudulent reservations and flagged these individuals in our security database. They will not be boarding any Skyline Airlines flight today, and their identification information has been forwarded to airport security for investigation." Kai looked up at his sisters with wide eyes, his journal forgotten for the first time since the confrontation began. "Arya, what does that mean? Are we not going to London?" Arya knelt down to her brother's eye level, her face calm but her eyes blazing with the controlled fury that Vincent had taught her to channel into effective action. "It means, little brother, that these people have made a very serious mistake, and now Daddy is going to have to teach them something about respect." She stood up and pulled out her satellite phone, holding it where Derek could see it clearly. "Derek, I want you to watch very carefully because you're about to learn who you just decided to go to war against." Derek watched with growing unease as Arya scrolled through her satellite phone's contact list, her finger hovering over a number labeled simply Daddy. Emergency line. The expensive device looked far too sophisticated for a college student to own, and for the first time since the confrontation began, Derek felt a flutter of genuine doubt about his assumptions. "Wait," Derek said, his voice carrying less certainty than before. "Before you make any calls, let's just take a step back and figure out what really happened here." Arya looked up from her phone, her expression showing mild surprise at Derek's sudden change in tone. "What happened here is that you refused to verify our legitimate booking, accused us of multiple federal crimes, and then canceled our confirmed reservations without cause. Now you want to take a step back." Linda moved closer to Derek, sensing that the situation was spiraling beyond their ability to control it, but still reluctant to admit that they might have made a catastrophic error. "Derek, maybe we should call a supervisor before this goes any further." "I am the supervisor on duty," Derek replied, but his voice lacked the confidence he had displayed moments earlier. The reality of his actions was beginning to sink in, and he was starting to understand that canceling legitimate reservations based on racial profiling could have serious consequences for his career. Zara held up her phone, which was still recording the entire interaction. "Derek, would you like to make a statement for the record about why you canceled our reservations? I want to make sure we have your explanation captured clearly before we escalate this to corporate management." The crowd of passengers was now large enough to constitute a significant portion of the first-class check-in area, and their mood had shifted from impatience to fascination as they witnessed what appeared to be a major customer service disaster unfolding in real time. Several people were live-streaming the confrontation on social media, and hashtags related to airline discrimination were already beginning to trend. Kai opened his journal to a fresh page and looked up at Derek with the earnest expression that only children could manage in serious situations. "Mr. Derek, can you explain to me why canceling our tickets was the right thing to do? I'm trying to understand the lesson here." Derek felt a growing sense of panic as he realized that every word he spoke was being recorded from multiple angles and broadcast to potentially thousands of viewers. His initial confidence in his authority had evaporated, replaced by the dawning recognition that he might have just made a career-ending mistake. "Look, son," Derek said, kneeling down to Kai's level in an attempt to appear more sympathetic. "Sometimes adults have to make difficult decisions to protect everyone's safety. I thought I was doing the right thing." Kai considered Derek's explanation with the seriousness he gave to all adult reasoning. "But, Mr. Derek, how does canceling our tickets protect anyone's safety? We weren't doing anything dangerous. We were just trying to check in for our flight." The simple logic of Kai's question exposed the fundamental flaw in Derek's justification, and murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd of observers. People were beginning to understand that they were witnessing not a security procedure, but a discrimination incident that had been disguised as policy enforcement. Arya made her decision and pressed the speed dial button on her satellite phone. The connection was immediate and clear, and Vincent's voice came through with the crystal clarity that only military-grade communication devices provided. "Aria, sweetheart, how's the check-in going?" Vincent's voice was warm and familiar, the tone of a father checking on his children during routine travel. "Hi, Daddy," Aria said, her voice loud enough for Derek and Linda to hear clearly. "We're having some trouble at the Skyline Airlines counter. The duty manager canceled our confirmed reservations and accused us of fraud and terrorism." The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds, but it felt like an eternity to everyone listening. When Vincent spoke again, his voice had transformed completely, becoming the cold, controlled tone of a CEO who was about to destroy someone's world. "Put me on speaker, Aria. I want everyone at that counter to hear what I'm about to say." Aria pressed the speaker button and held the phone up so that Vincent's voice filled the entire check-in area. The crowd fell silent, sensing that they were about to witness something extraordinary. "This is Vincent Beaumont, Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of Chimera Energy Group. Would the duty manager please identify himself?" Derek's face went completely white as he heard the name that appeared on Skyline Airlines' most important supplier contracts, the name that signed agreements worth hundreds of millions of dollars in annual fuel purchases. He had canceled the reservations of the CEO's family and accused his children of terrorist activities. "Sir, this is Derek Walsh, duty manager for premium services," Derek managed to say, his voice cracking slightly as he spoke. Vincent's response was measured and terrifying in its calm precision. "Mr. Walsh, you have accused my daughters of fraud, terrorism, and hacking, and you have canceled their confirmed first-class reservations without cause. You have also suggested that my 10-year-old son is participating in criminal activities. Is this an accurate summary of your actions?" Derek looked around desperately for support from Linda, from airport security, from anyone who might help him escape the trap he had built for himself, but he found only hostile faces and recording devices pointed in his direction. "Sir, There was confusion about the legitimacy of the booking, and I followed standard security protocols," Derek said, grasping for any justification that might minimize his culpability. Vincent's laugh was cold and humorless. "Mr. Walsh, I'm looking at my computer screen right now, and I can see that Chimera Energy Group spent $47 million with Skyline Airlines last year for fuel purchases and logistics support. My daughters were traveling to London to negotiate a partnership that would have increased that spending by 60%. The mathematical implications hit Derek like a physical blow. He was not dealing with college students trying to scam an upgrade. He was dealing with the family that controlled the fuel supply for the majority of Skyline's fleet operations. However, Vincent continued, his voice growing colder with each word. "Since you have determined that my family is not welcome on Skyline Airlines flights, I see no reason why Skyline Airlines should be welcome to purchase Chimera fuel." Linda grabbed Derek's arm, her face showing pure terror as she realized the magnitude of what was happening. "Mr. Beaumont, sir, please, this was a misunderstanding. We can reinstate the reservations immediately." Vincent's voice cut through her plea like a blade. "Miss Morrison, my daughters have been standing at your counter for 25 minutes, giving you multiple opportunities to verify their legitimate booking. Instead of showing them the courtesy and respect that any customer deserves, you chose to treat them like criminals based on their appearance." Kai raised his small hand, and Vincent's tone softened slightly when he saw his youngest son. "Yes, Kai Daddy, Mr. Derek said I was helping criminals, and Miss Linda said we don't belong in first class because of how we look. Why would they say those things?" Vincent's response carried the weight of a father's protective fury and a CEO's absolute authority. "They said those things, son, because they forgot that every person deserves to be treated with dignity and respect regardless of what they look like or how old they are. But they're about to learn that lesson right now." Derek made one final desperate attempt to salvage the situation. "Mr. Beaumont, please, if we could just step back and handle this professionally, I'm sure we can find a resolution that works for everyone." Vincent's response was swift and final. "Mr. Walsh, you had the opportunity to handle this professionally 25 minutes ago. Now you're going to handle the consequences." The check-in area of Terminal 4 had transformed from a routine customer service zone into something resembling a public forum with passengers abandoning their own travel preparations to witness what was clearly becoming a historic confrontation between corporate power and individual prejudice. The crowd now included not just first-class travelers, but economy passengers who had been drawn by the commotion, airport employees who were supposed to be working other areas, and even a few flight crews who had stopped to see what was causing the disruption. Margaret Chen, a freelance journalist traveling to London for a technology conference, had been recording the interaction since Derek first raised his voice, and she was now live-streaming the confrontation to her professional social media accounts. Her followers included several thousand technology and business professionals, and the viewer count was climbing rapidly as people shared the stream across multiple platforms. "This is Margaret Chen reporting from JFK Terminal 4. She whispered into her phone's microphone, where we're witnessing what appears to be a major discrimination incident involving Skyline Airlines staff and the family of Vincent Beaumont, CEO of Chimera Energy Group. The duty manager has just canceled confirmed first-class reservations and accused the CEO's children of terrorism." Behind Margaret, a group of college students who had been traveling for a study abroad program were recording their own videos, adding commentary about discrimination in the airline industry and sharing clips that were already receiving thousands of views on TikTok and Instagram. The hashtags #Skyline Discrimination and #Boycott Skyline were beginning to trend as the story spread across social media platforms. Robert Morrison, the businessman who had been waiting in line behind the Beaumont family, pulled out his own phone and began dialing a number from his contacts list. As a frequent business traveler and Skyline Airlines Platinum member, Robert had the direct number for the airline's customer relations department, and he was determined to speak with someone in authority about what he had witnessed. "This is Robert Morrison, Platinum member, number 4, A7B9C, he said when the call connected. "I'm standing at the first-class check-in desk at JFK, and I'm watching your duty manager destroy your company's relationship with your largest fuel supplier because he refused to check in 3 black passengers who had legitimate tickets." Linda overheard Robert's phone call and felt a new wave of panic wash over her as she realized that the incident was being reported directly to corporate headquarters by multiple witnesses. Her 22 years of service to the airline had been built on following procedures and maintaining customer satisfaction, and she could see both of those pillars crumbling around her. Derek, Linda whispered urgently, "We need to call our district manager right now. This is going to reach corporate executives in the next few minutes, and we need to get ahead of it." Derek was staring at his computer screen where the canceled reservation for the Beaumont family glowed like an accusation. The VIP flags and executive family notations that he had dismissed as fraudulent were clearly visible in the archived transaction, providing undeniable evidence that he had canceled legitimate bookings for Chimera Energy's CEO and his children. An elderly woman named Helen Martinez, who was traveling with her husband to visit their grandchildren in London, approached Kai with a gentle smile and knelt down to his eye level. "Sweetheart, are you okay? Do you understand what's happening here?" Kai looked up from his journal where he had been carefully documenting the names and statements of everyone involved in the confrontation. "Yes, ma'am. Mr. Derek and Miss Linda treated my sisters unfairly because they didn't think we belonged in first class, and now Daddy is going to make sure other families don't get treated the same way." Helen's heart broke at the mature way Kai was processing adult cruelty, and she turned to face Derek with the righteous anger of a grandmother who had seen too much injustice in her 73 years. "Young man, you should be ashamed of yourself. These children have done nothing but try to check in for their flight, and you've treated them like criminals." The crowd murmured its agreement with Helen's assessment, and Derek felt the weight of dozens of hostile eyes focused on him. Every person in the check-in area had watched the interaction unfold, and the consensus was overwhelmingly clear that the airline staff had acted inappropriately. Captain Jennifer Walsh, no relation to Derek, despite the shared surname, was the pilot scheduled to fly Flight 447 to London that morning. She had been walking through the terminal to check on passenger boarding when she noticed the unusual crowd gathering at the premium check-in desk. As she got close enough to hear Vincent's voice on the speakerphone, she realized that her flight was at the center of a corporate crisis that could have serious implications for her crew and passengers. "Excuse me," Captain Walsh said, approaching Derek with the authority that airline pilots commanded in airport environments. "I'm Captain Walsh, pilot in command for Flight 447. Can someone explain to me why passengers for my flight are being denied boarding?" Derek looked at Captain Walsh with relief, hoping that another authority figure might help him regain control of the situation. "Captain, we have passengers attempting to board with fraudulent tickets, and they've escalated the situation by claiming to be related to corporate executives." Captain Walsh looked at Aria's satellite phone where Vincent's voice was still connected on speaker. "Sir, this is Captain Walsh speaking. Are you indeed Vincent Beaumont of Chimera Energy?" Vincent's response was immediate and clear. "Captain Walsh, yes, I am Vincent Beaumont, and these are my children who your duty manager has refused to allow on your flight despite their confirmed first-class reservations." Captain Walsh felt her stomach drop as she realized the magnitude of what was happening. Chimera Energy wasn't just another vendor. They were the strategic partner that made Skyline Airlines operations possible. Alienating Vincent Beaumont wasn't just bad customer service, it was corporate suicide. "Mr. Beaumont," Captain Walsh said, "I want to personally apologize for any inconvenience your family has experienced. I will personally ensure that they are accommodated on this flight with the highest level of service." Vincent's response was polite but firm. "Captain Walsh, I appreciate your professionalism, but the damage has already been done. My children have been publicly humiliated and accused of crimes they didn't commit. An apology isn't sufficient to address that level of mistreatment." Derek made one last desperate attempt to justify his actions. "Sir Captain Walsh, we were following security procedures to protect all passengers from potential threats." Kai raised his hand again, his small voice cutting through Derek's explanation. "Mr. Derek, what threat were we? We didn't have any weapons. We weren't yelling or being mean to anyone. We just wanted to get on our airplane." The simplicity and honesty of Kai's question silenced Derek completely, and the crowd of witnesses began to understand that they had been watching an adult systematically discriminate against a family while using security procedures as a justification for prejudice. Margaret Chen continued her live commentary for her growing audience of online viewers. "Ladies and gentlemen, what we're witnessing here is a perfect example of how institutional bias operates in corporate America. These airline employees saw a black family and immediately assumed they didn't belong in first class despite clear evidence to the contrary." The story was spreading beyond the airport now as passengers shared videos and photos on social media platforms. Business journalists were picking up the story. Aviation industry analysts were beginning to comment on the potential implications for Skyline Airlines, and corporate communications teams across the airline industry were monitoring the situation with growing concern. Derek realized that his career was over, but he was about to learn that personal consequences were only the beginning of what Vincent Beaumont had planned for Skyline Airlines. The atmosphere in Terminal 4 had reached a pressure that felt almost explosive, with hundreds of travelers, airline employees, and airport staff now aware that they were witnessing a confrontation that would have implications far beyond a single delayed flight. The social media amplification had transformed a customer service incident into a public relations catastrophe that was being viewed by thousands of people across the globe in real time. Aria stood holding her satellite phone with Vincent still connected on speaker, while Zara continued recording everything with her phone, and Kai documented quotes and observations in his journal with the methodical precision their father had taught him. The family presented a picture of calm dignity in the center of a storm they had not created, but were now fully prepared to weather. Derek stood frozen behind his computer terminal, staring at the evidence of his catastrophic mistake displayed on multiple screens. The canceled Beaumont reservation showed VIP status executive family flags and payment confirmations that clearly indicated legitimate bookings worth thousands of dollars. His attempt to cover his prejudice with security concerns had created a digital trail that would be examined by federal investigators, corporate lawyers, and civil rights organizations. Linda felt 22 years of career pride crumbling around her as she watched the faces in the crowd, seeing the disappointment, anger, and disgust that decent people felt when witnessing injustice. Her Service Excellence Award felt like a mockery, now a reminder of standards she had abandoned when faced with passengers who didn't match her assumptions about who belonged in premium airline services. Daddy Kai said into the phone, his voice carrying the weight of questions that had been building since the confrontation began. Why did Mr. Derek and Miss Linda think we were criminals? What did we do that looked dangerous to them? The silence that followed Kai's question was profound as every adult in the area confronted the reality that a 10-year-old child was asking them to explain racial prejudice in terms that made sense to an innocent mind. Vincent's voice, when he finally responded, carried the pain of a father who had hoped his children might grow up in a world where such questions weren't necessary. Kai's son, sometimes. People make assumptions about others based on what they look like, rather than how they behave, or what they accomplish. Vincent said gently. Mr. Derek and Miss Linda saw our family and decided we couldn't possibly belong in first class even though we had paid for our tickets and done everything correctly. Derek felt compelled to defend himself even though every word he had spoken had only made his situation worse. Mr. Beaumont, sir, this wasn't about race. This was about following security procedures to protect all passengers from fraudulent bookings. Vincent's response was swift and devastating. Mr. Walsh, if this was about security procedures, why didn't you check my daughter's booking in your computer system? Why didn't you verify their payment information? Why didn't you review their travel history or frequent flyer status? You canceled legitimate reservations without performing a single verification step. Captain Walsh, who had been listening to the exchange with growing horror, stepped forward to address her crew responsibilities. Mr. Beaumont, I have to ask directly, will this incident affect Chimera's fuel service to Flight 447? I have 200 passengers depending on my ability to get them to London safely. Vincent's answer sent a chill through every airline employee within earshot. Captain Walsh, I'm currently looking at the fuel delivery schedules for JFK LaGuardia and Newark airports. Chimera Energy Group provides aviation fuel to approximately 70% of commercial flights operating in the New York metropolitan area. The mathematical implications hit the crowd like a physical blow. Vincent wasn't just threatening to deny fuel to a single flight. He was describing his ability to shut down the majority of commercial aviation operations across multiple airports serving one of the world's largest metropolitan areas. Since Skyline Airlines has determined that my family is not welcome as passengers, Vincent continued, his voice carrying the absolute authority of someone who controlled critical infrastructure. I see no reason why Skyline Airlines should continue to benefit from Chimera's fuel services. Derek grabbed Linda's arm in panic as the full scope of his mistake became clear. He hadn't just insulted important customers. He had attacked the family of the man who controlled the fuel supply for their entire fleet. Without Chimera's cooperation, Skyline Airlines would be forced to ground every aircraft on the East Coast within hours. Margaret Chen's live stream audience had grown to over 50,000 viewers as news outlets began picking up her feed and sharing it across their own platforms. The hashtag Chimera boycott was trending nationally, and aviation industry stocks were beginning to show volatility as investors recognized the potential for widespread flight disruptions. This is unprecedented, Margaret whispered to her online audience. We're watching a single discrimination incident potentially trigger the shutdown of multiple airport operations. The power dynamics here are absolutely extraordinary. Linda made a desperate attempt to salvage the situation, approaching Arya and Zara with tears in her eyes. "Please, I have a teenage son, and I've been working here for over 20 years. I made a mistake, but I can fix it. I can reinstate your reservations right now." Zara looked at Linda with a mixture of sadness and determination. "Linda, you had 25 minutes to make this right. Every time we asked you to check our booking, you refused. Every time we showed you our confirmations, you dismissed them. You didn't make a mistake. You made a choice." Kai looked up from his journal and asked Linda directly, "Miss Linda, if we looked different, would you have checked our tickets?" Linda's inability to answer Kai's question was answer enough, and the crowd of witnesses understood that they were seeing the human cost of institutional prejudice. A career built on following procedures had been destroyed by the decision to ignore those procedures when it came to passengers who didn't fit predetermined expectations. Airport security finally arrived, but their presence only highlighted the absurdity of the situation. The officers found themselves facing a calm family with legitimate travel documents surrounded by hundreds of witnesses who were documenting every moment of an incident that had spiraled far beyond their training or authority. "Sir," the lead security officer said to Vincent through the phone, "I'm Sergeant Rodriguez with Airport Security. Can you help us understand what resolution you're seeking here?" Vincent's response was measured and final. "Sergeant Rodriguez, I'm seeking accountability for the discrimination my children have experienced and assurance that other families won't be subjected to the same treatment. Since Skyline Airlines has demonstrated that they cannot provide either, Chimera Energy Group will be terminating our fuel supply contracts effective immediately." Derek felt his knees go weak as he realized that Vincent wasn't bluffing or negotiating. He was implementing a business decision that would cost Skyline Airlines millions of dollars and potentially destroy hundreds of careers throughout the company. The breaking point had been reached, and everyone in Terminal 4 understood that they were witnessing the moment when corporate prejudice collided with corporate power, and power was about to win decisively. Vincent's voice carried across Terminal 4 with the unmistakable authority of a man who had spent decades building relationships that could reshape entire industries with a single phone call, and Derek Walsh was about to learn that abstract corporate power became terrifyingly real when it was wielded by someone whose children had been humiliated in public. "Arya, I need you to step away from the counter so that every word of this conversation is recorded clearly," Vincent said, his voice shifting into the tone that executives across the energy sector had learned to recognize as non-negotiable. "Mr. Walsh, Miss Morrison, I want you both to understand exactly what's going to happen in the next 60 seconds. Derek felt sweat break out across his forehead despite the air conditioning in the terminal, and Linda gripped the edge of the counter so tightly that her knuckles went white. Neither of them had ever been on the receiving end of this level of corporate power, and they were beginning to understand that their individual careers were about to be sacrificed to protect much larger business interests. Daddy Kai said, his young voice cutting through the tension with the clarity that only children could provide. "Are you going to shut down the airplanes because Mr. Derek and Miss Linda were mean to us?" Vincent's laugh was devoid of humor, but his tone softened when addressing his youngest son. "Kai, I'm going to make sure that Skyline Airlines understands that treating customers badly has consequences, especially when those customers are children who have done nothing wrong." Captain Walsh stepped forward, her pilot training compelling her to focus on passenger safety even in the midst of a corporate crisis. "Mr. Beaumont, I have 200 passengers boarded for Flight 447, including families with young children. If fuel services are interrupted, those passengers will be stranded." Vincent's response revealed the careful consideration that successful CEOs brought to decisions that affected thousands of people. "Captain Walsh, I understand your concern for passenger safety, and I want to be clear that this action is not directed at travelers who have done nothing wrong. However, Skyline Airlines management needs to understand that discrimination against passengers has consequences that extend far beyond the individuals who are directly targeted." Derek made one final desperate attempt to minimize the situation. "Sir, Mr. Beaumont, perhaps we can resolve this internally through our customer service procedures. I have the authority to issue compensation vouchers and frequent flyer mile bonuses for any inconvenience your family has experienced." The silence that followed Derek's offer was so complete that the ambient noise of the terminal seemed to amplify, and everyone within earshot understood that Derek had just demonstrated his fundamental misunderstanding of what was happening around him. "Mr. Walsh," Vincent said, his voice carrying a dangerous calm that made several passengers instinctively step backward. "You believe that 25 minutes of publicly humiliating my children, accusing them of terrorism, and canceling their confirmed reservations can be resolved with vouchers and frequent flyer miles?" Arya held the satellite phone closer to her mouth, ensuring that her father's voice would be clearly audible to the growing crowd of witnesses. "Derek, my father has never accepted compensation for discrimination. When someone treats his family unfairly because of our race, he makes sure that changes are implemented to protect other families from experiencing the same treatment." Zara pulled out her own phone and began scrolling through social media, watching as videos of the confrontation spread across multiple platforms and generated thousands of comments from viewers who were expressing outrage at the airline staff's behavior. "Daddy, this is already going viral. The video of Derek canceling our tickets has been shared over 10,000 times in the last 15 minutes. Vincent's voice took on the strategic tone that his children had heard him use during major business negotiations, and Derek realized that he was no longer dealing with an angry parent seeking personal satisfaction, but with a corporate strategist who was about to implement a carefully planned response to institutional discrimination. "Ladies and gentlemen," Vincent announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the check-in area, "I am about to demonstrate to Skyline Airlines and the entire aviation industry that treating customers with dignity is not optional. It is essential for business survival." Margaret Chen continued her live commentary for her online audience, which had now grown to over 100,000 viewers, as major news outlets began sharing her stream. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are witnessing what may be the most expensive customer service failure in aviation history. Vincent Beaumont is about to use his company's fuel contracts as leverage to demand accountability for discrimination." Derek looked around desperately for someone with higher authority who could override his decisions and offer Vincent whatever concessions might prevent the corporate disaster that was developing. But he was slowly realizing that his actions had elevated the situation beyond the level where standard customer service protocols could provide a solution. "Mr. Beaumont," Sergeant Rodriguez said, stepping forward with the careful neutrality that security professionals used when they found themselves in situations that extended beyond their normal jurisdiction. "What specific resolution would satisfy your concerns about this incident?" Vincent's answer was precise and non-negotiable. "Sergeant Rodriguez, I want 3 things first: a public acknowledgement from Skyline Airlines that my children were subjected to racial discrimination. Second, the immediate termination of the employees who engaged in this discrimination. And third, the implementation of comprehensive bias training for all customer-facing staff." Linda felt her career dissolving around her as Vincent outlined demands that would cost her everything she had worked for over the past 2 decades. "Please, Mr. Beaumont, I have a family to support, and I made an honest mistake. Can't we find a solution that doesn't destroy my life?" Kai looked up at Linda with the devastating honesty that adults often found difficult to hear from children. "Miss Linda, you said mean things about my sisters and made them feel bad. When I do something wrong, Daddy makes me apologize and helps me understand why it was wrong. Did you apologize to my sisters?" Linda's inability to answer Kai's simple question exposed the fundamental problem with her request for mercy. She was asking for forgiveness, without acknowledging responsibility or demonstrating understanding of the harm she had caused. Vincent's voice cut through Linda's silence with final authority. "Miss Morrison, My children gave you multiple opportunities to treat them with basic human dignity, and you chose discrimination instead. Now you're going to learn that choices have consequences." Derek realized that nothing he could say would change Vincent's decision, and his last hope was that someone with greater corporate authority might arrive to negotiate a settlement that would save his job and prevent the airline industry crisis that was about to unfold. "Mr. Beaumont," Derek said, his voice barely above a whisper, "what happens to all the other employees at Skyline Airlines if you terminate our fuel contracts? Pilots, flight attendants, mechanics, ground crew. None of them had anything to do with this incident." Vincent's response revealed the careful consideration that ethical leaders brought to decisions that affected thousands of innocent people. "Mr. Walsh, those employees will find new jobs with airlines that understand the importance of treating all customers with respect. The aviation industry will continue to exist. It will just operate with different values." The terminal had fallen completely silent except for Vincent's voice, and everyone present understood that they were witnessing a moment when individual prejudice was about to collide with corporate power at a scale that would reshape an entire industry's approach to customer relations. What happened next would be studied in business schools for decades as a case study in how quickly corporate power could be wielded when family dignity was at stake, and how the decisions made by individual employees could trigger consequences that extended far beyond their original scope or intention. Vincent's voice carried across the terminal with the authority of someone who was about to reshape the aviation industry in real time. "I'm now contacting Chimera Energy Group's Operations Center to issue an immediate suspension of fuel services to all Skyline Airlines aircraft at JFK LaGuardia and Newark airports." Derek watched in horror as Vincent made a second phone call on a different line, speaking to someone identified only as Operations Command. The conversation was brief, technical, and devastating in its efficiency. "This is Vincent Beaumont Authorization Code, Alpha 77, Charlie. Implement immediate stop work protocol for all Skyline Airlines fuel services in the New York metropolitan area. Reason breach of non-discrimination clause in customer service agreement. Duration indefinite pending resolution of discrimination complaint." Captain Walsh felt her stomach drop as she realized that her flight, along with every other Skyline Airlines departure from the 3 major New York area airports, was about to be grounded indefinitely. "Mr. Beaumont, sir, I need to inform my passengers immediately about this development." What should I tell them about the timeline for resolution? Vincent's response was measured but uncompromising. "Captain Walsh, you should tell your passengers that their flight has been delayed due to a customer service failure by Skyline Airlines management, and that service will resume when the airline demonstrates a commitment to treating all customers with dignity." Linda grabbed Derek's arm as the magnitude of what was happening became clear to both of them. "Derek, what have we done? This isn't just about our jobs anymore. This is about the entire airline's operations." Derek stared at his computer screen where alerts were beginning to appear indicating fuel service interruptions across multiple airports. The operational impact was immediate and severe. Aircraft couldn't depart without full fuel loads, and Chimera Energy Group controlled the vast majority of aviation fuel infrastructure in the region. Kai raised his hand to get his father's attention through the phone. "Daddy, are all the airplanes going to stop flying because of what Mr. Derek did to us?" Vincent's voice softened when addressing his youngest son, but his words carried implications that sent chills through every airline employee in the terminal. "Some airplanes are going to stop flying until the people in charge of this airline learn how to treat families like ours with respect." Margaret Chen's live stream audience had grown to over 200,000 viewers as news organizations worldwide began covering the story of corporate power being used to address racial discrimination in real time. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are witnessing history being made. Vincent Beaumont is using his company's strategic position in the aviation industry to force accountability for discrimination against his family." Sergeant Rodriguez received a call on his radio from airport operations, and his face grew pale as he listened to the report. All units be advised that we have confirmation of fuel service interruption to multiple carriers at JFK. Ground stop procedures are being implemented for departing flights pending resolution of service provider issues. Derek felt his legs go weak as he realized that his decision to cancel the Beaumont family's reservations had triggered a ground stop that would affect thousands of passengers and cost the airline industry millions of dollars. Mr. Beaumont, please, sir, this has gone far beyond what I intended. Can we find a way to resolve this without punishing innocent travelers? Vincent's response revealed the strategic thinking that had built his company into a dominant force in the energy sector. Mr. Walsh, innocent travelers are being punished because you chose to discriminate against my children rather than following basic customer service procedures. The responsibility for those consequences rests with you and your employer. Arya watched as airport staff began implementing emergency procedures throughout Terminal 4, with departure boards switching from scheduled times to delayed. Fuel service interruption across dozens of flights. Derek, do you understand now that actions have consequences that extend far beyond the people you directly hurt? Zara continued recording everything while monitoring social media where the hashtag Justice for Beaumont was trending nationally and international news outlets were beginning to cover the story. The whole world is watching this, Derek. Every major news organization is covering how you treated a 10-year-old boy and his sisters. Linda made one final desperate appeal to Vincent through the phone. Mr. Beaumont, I have worked for this airline for 22 years. I made a terrible mistake, but destroying my career won't undo the hurt I caused your children. Can't we find another way to make this right? Kai looked up from his journal, where he had been documenting the unfolding crisis, and asked Linda directly, Miss Linda, if destroying someone's career is wrong, why did you try to destroy our trip to London? We didn't do anything bad to you. Linda's inability to answer Kai's question exposed the fundamental hypocrisy in her plea for mercy. She was asking for forgiveness while still failing to acknowledge the full impact of her discriminatory behavior. Vincent's voice carried across the terminal as he addressed the crowd of witnesses who had gathered to watch the confrontation unfold. Ladies and gentlemen, what you've witnessed today is a perfect example of how institutional discrimination operates in corporate America. My children were treated like criminals because airline employees made assumptions based on their race and age. Derek made one last attempt to negotiate a resolution that might save his career and prevent further damage to the airline industry. Mr. Beaumont, what would it take for you to restore fuel services? What can I personally do to make this right? Vincent's answer was swift and final. Mr. Walsh, the time for you to make this right was 25 minutes ago when you chose to discriminate against my children rather than checking their legitimate booking. Now the consequences of that choice are out of your hands. Captain Walsh received an update from her crew and turned to address the crowd of passengers who had been watching the confrontation. Ladies and gentlemen, I've just been informed by my Flight Operations Center that all Skyline Airlines departures from the New York area have been suspended indefinitely due to fuel service interruptions. The announcement sent a ripple of shock through the terminal as passengers realized that the discrimination incident they had been witnessing was now affecting their own travel plans, and that individual prejudice had triggered an industry-wide crisis. Derek collapsed into a chair behind the counter as the full weight of his actions hit him. Understanding that his career was over and that thousands of people would be affected by the decision he had made based on racial assumptions rather than professional procedures. 23 minutes after Vincent Beaumont's call triggered the fuel stoppage, a black sedan with tinted windows pulled up to Terminal 4's VIP entrance, and James Crawford, Executive Vice President of Operations for Skyline Airlines, emerged with the grim expression of a man who had just learned that his company's largest strategic partnership was being terminated in real time. Crawford had been in a board meeting at Skyline's corporate headquarters when his assistant burst into the room with news that Chimera Energy Group had suspended fuel services to the airline's entire East Coast operations, and that the suspension was connected to a discrimination incident involving the CEO's family at JFK. The 12-minute ride to the airport had given Crawford time to understand the magnitude of the crisis and to realize that his company's survival might depend on how effectively he handled the next hour. Behind Crawford came a team of corporate lawyers, public relations specialists, and senior customer service executives, all of whom had been briefed on the situation during the emergency drive to the airport. They moved through the terminal with the focused urgency of people who understood that their company was facing an existential threat that could destroy decades of business relationships and cost hundreds of millions of dollars in lost revenue. Derek Walsh remained sitting behind the check-in counter, staring at his computer screen where dozens of flight cancellation alerts continued to appear as the fuel stoppage rippled through the airline's operations. He looked like a man who had just realized that his individual prejudice had triggered a corporate catastrophe that would affect thousands of people and potentially end his career forever. Linda Morrison stood beside Derek, her 22 years of airline experience providing no guidance for a situation where her discrimination against customers had escalated into an industry crisis. She watched Crawford approach with the growing understanding that her Service Excellence Award and decades of professional dedication would be meaningless in the face of the evidence that her behavior had violated both company policy and federal law. Mr. Beaumont Crawford said as he approached Aria, who was still holding the satellite phone with Vincent connected, "This is James Crawford, Executive Vice President of Operations for Skyline Airlines. I want to personally apologize for the treatment your family has received and to assure you that this incident does not reflect our company's values or policies." Vincent's voice carried clearly through the phone's speaker, reaching the crowd of witnesses who had been documenting the confrontation for the past 30 minutes. "Mr. Crawford, I appreciate your personal apology, but your employees accused my children of terrorism and canceled their confirmed reservations without performing any verification procedures. An apology is insufficient to address that level of institutional discrimination." Crawford felt sweat break out on his forehead as he realized that standard corporate damage control procedures would be inadequate for addressing Vincent's concerns and restoring the fuel services that his airline desperately needed to resume operations. "Sir, I have the authority to immediately reinstate your family's reservations, provide complimentary upgrades to our premium service level, and issue significant travel vouchers as compensation for this incident." Kai looked up from his journal where he had been carefully recording the dialogue and observations from the escalating crisis. "Mr. Crawford, why do grown-ups always think money can fix everything? Mr. Derek and Miss Linda hurt our feelings because they didn't think we belonged here. How does giving us vouchers make that feeling go away?" Crawford felt a chill as he realized that the 10-year-old boy was asking questions that cut straight to the heart of his company's liability and exposed the inadequacy of financial compensation for addressing discrimination. Corporate lawyers had trained him to offer monetary settlements for customer service failures, but no one had prepared him to explain to a child why his family had been treated like criminals. Margaret Chen continued her live commentary for her online audience, which had grown to over 300,000 viewers as the story gained international attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're watching a masterclass in corporate crisis management as Skyline Airlines executives attempt to contain a discrimination incident that has already cost them millions of dollars in suspended operations." Aria looked directly at Crawford, her young face showing the composed dignity that Vincent had taught his children to maintain in the face of injustice. "Mr. Crawford, your employees had multiple opportunities to treat us with basic respect, and they chose discrimination instead. My father is now demonstrating what happens when companies fail to train their staff properly." Zara held up her phone, which showed the social media explosion that was occurring as videos of the incident spread across multiple platforms. "Mr. Crawford, this story is being shared by hundreds of thousands of people right now. Everyone can see how your employees treated us, and everyone can see how your company is responding." Crawford looked at the footage on Zara's phone and felt his stomach drop as he realized that the incident was being documented from multiple angles and broadcast to a global audience in real time. The public relations implications alone would cost his company millions of dollars regardless of the operational impact of the fuel stoppage. One of Crawford's lawyers whispered urgently in his ear about the legal exposure the company was facing for discrimination violations, and Crawford understood that federal investigations were inevitable regardless of how quickly they resolved the immediate crisis. "Mr. Beaumont," Crawford said, addressing Vincent through the phone, "what would it take for Chimera Energy Group to resume fuel services while we work together to address the systemic issues that allowed this incident to occur?" Vincent's response was immediate and non-negotiable. "Mr. Crawford, fuel services will resume when 3 conditions are met. First, the employees who engaged in discrimination against my children are immediately terminated. Second, Skyline Airlines issues a public acknowledgement that my family was subjected to racial profiling. And third, your company implements comprehensive bias training for all customer-facing staff." Derek felt his career dissolving as he listened to Vincent's demands, understanding that his decision to cancel legitimate reservations based on racial assumptions would cost him everything he had worked to achieve in the airline industry. "Mr. Crawford, sir, I was following what I believed were appropriate security procedures. I didn't intend for this to become a discrimination issue." Crawford looked at Derek with a mixture of anger and disappointment, recognizing that the duty manager's actions had created an existential threat to the company's operations. "Mr. Walsh, intention is irrelevant when the impact is this severe. You canceled confirmed reservations for our most important strategic partner's family without performing basic verification procedures." Kai raised his hand to get Crawford's attention, his young voice carrying the moral clarity that adults often found difficult to ignore. "Mr. Crawford, if Mr. Derek was following procedures, why didn't he check our tickets on his computer? Daddy says that when you're not sure about something, you should look for facts before making decisions." Crawford realized that the 10-year-old boy was exposing the fundamental flaw in Derek's justification. Proper security procedures would have involved verification, not assumption-based cancellation of legitimate bookings. Linda made one final desperate appeal to Crawford for intervention that might save her career. "Mr. Crawford, I've been with this company for 22 years without a single customer complaint. This was an isolated mistake and I can learn from it." Vincent's voice cut through Linda's plea with final authority. "Miss Morrison, my children are not isolated mistakes. They are human beings who deserve to be treated with dignity from the moment they approached your counter." Crawford understood that Vincent's demands were non-negotiable and that his company's survival depended on accepting accountability for the discrimination that had occurred under their corporate policies. Crawford gathered his legal team around him for a whispered conference while the crowd of witnesses continued to document every moment of the unfolding crisis, and the stark reality of Skyline Airlines' position became clear to everyone involved in the decision-making process that would determine the company's future. The head of Skyline's legal department, Patricia Vance, pulled out a tablet and showed Crawford the preliminary assessment of their liability exposure. "James, we have clear evidence of racial profiling captured on multiple video recordings posted across social media platforms and witnessed by hundreds of travelers. Federal civil rights violations, breach of transportation, anti-discrimination laws, and potential criminal liability for false accusations of terrorism." Crawford felt the weight of corporate responsibility settling on his shoulders as he realized that Vincent Beaumont wasn't just seeking personal satisfaction for the mistreatment of his family. He was demanding accountability that would prevent other families from experiencing the same discrimination in the future. Kai approached Crawford directly, his small stature requiring the executive to kneel down to make eye contact with the child, whose simple questions had been exposing the truth throughout the entire confrontation. "Mr. Crawford, can I ask you something that might help everyone understand what happened here?" Crawford nodded, recognizing that the 10-year-old boy had demonstrated more wisdom than many of the adults involved in the crisis. "Of course, Kai." "What's your question?" Kai opened his journal and pointed to the notes he had been taking during the incident. "I wrote down everything, mister," Derek and Miss Linda said to us, "and I want to know if you think they would have said the same things to a white family wearing the same clothes we're wearing." The question hit Crawford like a physical blow, forcing him to confront the obvious racial dimension of the incident that his employees had been trying to disguise as security procedures. He looked at Kai's careful handwriting, documenting quotes that clearly revealed the discriminatory nature of Derek and Linda's assumptions. Kai Crawford set his voice heavy with the weight of acknowledgement. "I don't believe they would have treated a white family the same way, and that's exactly the problem we need to fix." Derek felt compelled to defend himself one more time, even though every word he had spoken had only made his situation worse. "Mr. Crawford, I want to emphasize again that this wasn't about race. I was concerned about the legitimacy of their booking based on multiple factors." Arya looked directly at Derek, her voice carrying the controlled anger that came from being forced to defend her family's right to basic human dignity. "Derek, what factors besides our race could have led you to assume we were criminals? We approached your counter politely. We had legitimate documents, and we answered every question you asked." Derek's inability to provide a coherent answer that didn't reveal racial bias exposed the fundamental dishonesty of his continued denials, and the crowd of witnesses understood that they were watching someone who had been caught discriminating but lacked the character to accept responsibility. Linda made one final attempt to minimize her role in the incident, appealing to Crawford for understanding that might preserve some remnant of her career. "Mr. Crawford, I was trying to protect the airline from what I believed was fraudulent activity. I've seen countless scams over my 22 years of service." Zara pulled out her phone and showed Linda a video that had been shared thousands of times on social media. "Linda, this is footage of you refusing to look at our boarding passes and directing us to economy check-in without any verification. Can you explain how that was protecting the airline?" Linda watched the video evidence of her own discriminatory behavior and felt the final collapse of her justifications as she realized that her actions had been captured in detail and would be examined by investigators, lawyers, and civil rights organizations. Vincent's voice carried across the terminal as he addressed the broader implications of the incident for the airline industry. "Mr. Crawford, what happened to my children today happens to countless other families who don't have the resources or influence to demand accountability. The only difference is that my family can force changes that will protect other people from experiencing this treatment." Crawford understood that Vincent was using his corporate power to address institutional discrimination that extended far beyond a single incident, and that accepting Vincent's demands would require fundamental changes to how airlines trained and supervised customer-facing employees. Margaret Chen provided analysis for her online audience, which had grown to over 500,000 viewers as major news outlets began incorporating her live stream into their coverage. "Ladies and gentlemen, what we're witnessing is a perfect example of how individual prejudice becomes institutional discrimination when companies fail to hold employees accountable for biased behavior." Captain Walsh approached Crawford with operational updates that highlighted the broader impact of the crisis. "Sir, I've been informed that the fuel stoppage has now affected over 40 flights across 3 airports, with thousands of passengers stranded and connecting flights disrupted throughout the Skyline airline system." Crawford felt the full weight of corporate responsibility as he realized that Derek and Linda's discrimination against one family had triggered a crisis affecting thousands of innocent travelers and threatening the financial stability of the entire airline. Kai raised his hand again, drawing attention from everyone in the check-in area. "Mr. Crawford, if airlines are businesses that want customers to pay for tickets, why would anyone think it's okay to be mean to customers who already paid?" Crawford felt a moment of clarity as he realized that Kai's question exposed the fundamental business stupidity of discrimination companies that treated paying customers badly were essentially sabotaging their own success and profitability. "Kai, you're absolutely right," Crawford said loud enough for everyone to hear. There is no business justification for treating any customer the way your family has been treated today, and there's especially no justification for treating children like criminals. Derek made one last desperate attempt to avoid responsibility for his actions. Mr. Crawford, if we terminate my employment over this incident, what message does that send to other employees who are trying to protect airline security? Vincent's response was swift and devastating. Mr. Walsh, the message it sends is that discrimination disguised as security procedures will not be tolerated, and that employees who abuse their authority to harm innocent people will face consequences for their actions. Crawford looked at Derek and Linda, recognizing that their employment was no longer viable given the evidence of their discriminatory behavior and the legal exposure their actions had created for the company. The moment of reckoning had arrived, and everyone present understood that corporate accountability was about to be demonstrated in real time. Crawford made the decision that would define his leadership legacy and determine whether Skyline Airlines survived the crisis that had been triggered by two employees' choice to discriminate against a family based on racial assumptions, rather than following professional procedures. Derek Walsh. Linda Morrison. Crawford said, his voice carrying the authority of executive decision-making. Your employment with Skyline Airlines is terminated effective immediately for violation of federal anti-discrimination laws, breach of customer service protocols, and conduct incompatible with our corporate values. Derek felt his knees buckle as 20 years of aviation industry experience evaporated in a single sentence, understanding that his decision to cancel legitimate reservations based on racial profiling had not only cost him his career, but had triggered a crisis affecting thousands of people. Linda let out a sob as 22 years of professional dedication collapsed around her, recognizing that her Service Excellence Award and decades of customer service experience were meaningless in the face of evidence that she had treated customers differently based on their race. Mr. Crawford Derek said, his voice cracking with desperation, I have a mortgage, a family to support, and 20 years of experience in this industry. Can't we handle this through disciplinary action and additional training instead of termination? Crawford's response was swift and uncompromising. Mr. Walsh, you accused the CEO's children of terrorism and canceled their confirmed reservations without performing basic verification procedures. The legal liability alone makes your continued employment impossible. Kai looked up from his journal, where he had been documenting the consequences of the adult's decisions, and asked Crawford a question that cut to the heart of justice and accountability. Mr. Crawford, when people do wrong things, should they lose their jobs, or should they get a chance to learn and do better? Crawford knelt down to Kai's eye level, recognizing that the child was asking profound questions about justice, mercy, and the possibility of redemption that adults often struggled to answer clearly. Kai. That's an excellent question, and the answer depends on whether people acknowledge their mistakes and show genuine commitment to changing their behavior, Crawford said. Mr. Derek and Miss Linda had many opportunities to treat your family correctly, and they chose discrimination instead. Vincent's voice carried across the terminal as he addressed the broader questions of corporate accountability that Kai had raised. Son, sometimes people need to face consequences for their actions before they're willing to learn and change. Mr. Derek and Miss Linda hurt our family because they didn't think we deserved respect. Arya looked directly at Derek and Linda, both of whom were now facing the complete destruction of their careers and professional identities. Derek, Linda, my father taught us that power should be used to protect people, not to hurt them. You used your positions to try to humiliate us, and now you're learning what happens when you abuse authority. Zara continued recording as airport security began the process of escorting Derek and Linda from the secure area of the terminal, their airline identification badges confiscated, and their access to Skyline Airlines facilities permanently revoked. Margaret Chen provided commentary for her online audience as the terminations were implemented in real time. Ladies and gentlemen, we're watching immediate accountability for discrimination, As two airline employees lose their careers for racial profiling that was captured on video and witnessed by hundreds of travelers. Linda made one final plea as security prepared to escort her from the terminal. "Mr. Crawford, please, I have a 17-year-old son who needs expensive tutoring for learning disabilities. I can't afford to lose my health insurance and pension benefits." Crawford felt genuine sympathy for Linda's personal situation, but he understood that the company's legal exposure and ethical obligations required decisive action. "Miss Morrison, your personal circumstances don't justify the discriminatory treatment of customers, and the evidence of your behavior makes your continued employment legally impossible." Derek attempted to maintain his innocence even as security personnel prepared to remove him from the airport. "This is wrongful termination based on a misunderstanding. I was following security procedures to protect all passengers from potential threats." Kai raised his hand one more time, his young voice carrying the moral clarity that adults often found difficult to refute. "Mr. Derek, if you were protecting passengers from threats, why didn't you call security when we first came to your counter? Why did you wait until Daddy called before you got scared?" Derek's inability to answer Kai's question exposed the fundamental dishonesty of his continued denials, and everyone present understood that he was refusing to accept responsibility for behavior that had been clearly documented and witnessed by hundreds of people. Vincent addressed Crawford directly through the satellite phone. "Mr. Crawford, the termination of these employees is necessary but not sufficient. I want to see evidence that Skyline Airlines is implementing comprehensive changes to prevent other families from experiencing this treatment." Crawford understood that Vincent was demanding systemic reforms that would address the institutional problems that had allowed Derek and Linda's discrimination to occur in the first place. "Mr. Beaumont, I commit to implementing mandatory bias training for all customer service staff and establishing clear protocols for handling customer complaints about discriminatory treatment." Captain Walsh approached Crawford with operational updates about the impact of the fuel stoppage on the airline's broader operations. "Sir, we now have over 60 flights affected by the service interruption, with estimated losses approaching $12 million per hour if this continues." Crawford felt the financial weight of corporate accountability as he realized that Derek and Linda's discrimination against one family was costing his company millions of dollars and affecting thousands of travelers throughout the airline's network. As airport security escorted Derek and Linda toward the exit, the crowd of passengers who had witnessed the entire confrontation began to understand that they had seen immediate consequences for discrimination that was usually hidden or ignored in corporate America. The moment marked not just the end of two careers, but the beginning of an industry-wide conversation about accountability, dignity, and the real cost of prejudice in business environments. Crawford watched as Derek and Linda were escorted from the terminal by airport security, their badges confiscated and their access to Skyline Airlines facilities permanently revoked. Understanding that their termination was only the beginning of the accountability measures that Vincent Beaumont would demand before restoring fuel services to his airline. "Mr. Beaumont," Crawford said, addressing Vincent through the satellite phone that Aria continued to hold. "I've implemented your first demand by terminating the employees responsible for discriminating against your family. What additional steps can Skyline Airlines take to restore your confidence in our commitment to treating all customers with dignity?" Vincent's response revealed the comprehensive approach that successful CEOs brought to addressing institutional problems that required more than individual punishment to resolve effectively. "Mr. Crawford, terminating two employees doesn't address the training failures, supervision gaps, and cultural issues that allowed this discrimination to occur in the first place." Kai looked up from his journal where he had been documenting the consequences that were unfolding around the family as a result of Derek and Linda's discriminatory behavior. "Daddy, are the airplanes going to start flying again now that Mr. Derek and Miss Linda can't be mean to other families?" Vincent's voice softened when addressing his youngest son, but his words carried implications that made Crawford understand that individual accountability was only the first step in a broader transformation process. Kai. The airplanes will fly again when the people in charge prove that they've learned how to treat all families with respect, not just families like ours who have the power to demand fairness. Margaret Chen continued her live commentary for an online audience that had grown to over 700,000 viewers as the story gained international attention and sparked conversations about corporate accountability across multiple industries. Ladies and gentlemen, we're witnessing what may be the fastest corporate response to discrimination in business history, but Vincent Beaumont is clearly not satisfied with individual terminations. Crawford felt the pressure of thousands of affected passengers and millions of dollars in operational losses as he attempted to negotiate a resolution that would restore fuel services while meeting Vincent's demands for systemic change. Mr. Beaumont, I'm prepared to authorize immediate implementation of mandatory bias training for all Skyline Airlines customer service staff and to establish a customer dignity ombudsman position to investigate future discrimination complaints. Aria looked at Crawford with the analytical intelligence that Vincent had taught his children to apply to business negotiations, recognizing that corporate executives often made promises during crisis situations that they had no intention of maintaining once the immediate pressure was resolved. Mr. Crawford, Aria said, "My father has built his company by establishing partnerships based on trust and accountability. Your airline's employees accused us of terrorism and canceled our reservations without cause. Why should we believe that promises made under pressure will be honored when the pressure is removed?" Crawford felt the sting of Aria's challenge, understanding that the Beaumont family had legitimate reasons to doubt corporate commitments that were offered only after their economic leverage had forced accountability for discriminatory behavior. Zara held up her phone showing Crawford the social media explosion that was continuing to spread videos of the incident across multiple platforms. "Mr. Crawford, millions of people are now watching how your company responds to discrimination. The whole world will know if you fail to follow through on commitments made to our family." Crawford realized that the global attention focused on this incident would make it impossible for Skyline Airlines to quietly abandon any commitments they made to address institutional discrimination, creating external pressure that would ensure long-term accountability. Captain Walsh approached Crawford with news that would change the dynamic of the entire negotiation. "Sir, I've just been informed that Vincent Beaumont's private aircraft has been cleared for landing at JFK. Ground Control has been instructed to provide priority access to runway 4L for a Gulfstream G650 with tail number November 1, Charlie Beaumont." Crawford felt a chill as he realized that Vincent wasn't just threatening to suspend fuel services to force accountability. He was coming to JFK personally to ensure that his demands were met and that his children were treated with the dignity they deserved. Mr. Beaumont, Crawford said, "I understand that you're en route to JFK. I want to personally escort your children to your aircraft and ensure that they receive the highest level of service during their departure." Vincent's laugh was cold and professional. "Mr. Crawford, my children will not be departing on a Skyline Airlines flight. They've experienced quite enough of your company's customer service for one day. My aircraft will transport them to London safely while you implement the changes necessary to prevent other families from experiencing discrimination." Kai raised his hand to get Crawford's attention, his young voice carrying questions that adults often avoided asking directly. "Mr. Crawford, when you give people jobs at airlines, do you teach them to be nice to all customers, or do you teach them to be mean to customers who look different?" Crawford felt the devastating simplicity of Kai's question. Expose the fundamental training failures that had allowed Derek and Linda's discrimination to occur under corporate policies that were supposed to prevent exactly this type of behavior. Kai Crawford said, kneeling down to the child's eye level, "We clearly failed to teach our employees how to treat all customers with respect, and that's a failure of leadership that starts with executives like me." As the sound of approaching aircraft engines filled the terminal, everyone present understood that Vincent Beaumont was demonstrating the difference between corporate promises and corporate power, and that accountability for discrimination would be enforced through economic leverage rather than voluntary compliance. The distinctive whine of the Gulfstream G650's engines grew louder as Vincent's aircraft approached JFK, and Crawford understood that the next 30 minutes would determine whether Skyline Airlines survived the crisis that had been triggered by two employees' decision to discriminate against paying customers based on racial assumptions. Ground Control's voice crackled over the terminal's communication system as they coordinated Vincent's arrival. Skyline operations be advised that November 1 Charlie Beaumont is on final approach to runway 4L and will require immediate ground transport to Terminal 4 for passenger pickup. Crawford felt the weight of corporate responsibility as he realized that Vincent was coming to collect his children personally, demonstrating that no amount of apology or compensation could restore the trust that had been destroyed by Derek and Linda's discriminatory behavior. Mr. Beaumont Crawford said through the satellite phone, "I want to ensure that your family's departure experience completely makes up for the treatment they received at our check-in counter. What can Skyline Airlines do to provide appropriate service for the remainder of their time in our terminal?" Vincent's response was measured and professional, but carried undertones that made Crawford understand that corporate relationships built over decades could be destroyed by individual employees' prejudice in a matter of minutes. "Mr. Crawford, my children will be departing from JFK on my aircraft, not on yours. Your responsibility now is to ensure that other families don't experience the discrimination that mine has endured." Kai looked around the terminal at the crowds of passengers whose flights had been delayed or canceled as a result of the fuel stoppage, understanding that Derek and Linda's treatment of his family had created problems for thousands of innocent people. "Daddy, are all these people stuck at the airport because Mr. Derek was mean to us?" Vincent's voice carried the complexity of a father explaining adult consequences to a child, while also addressing the broader corporate audience that was listening to every word. "Kai, these people are stuck because an airline company forgot that treating customers with dignity is essential for business success. Sometimes companies need dramatic reminders about basic human decency." Margaret Chen provided analysis for her online audience as the situation continued to evolve beyond a simple customer service complaint into a case study of corporate accountability and economic leverage. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're watching Vincent Beaumont use his company's strategic position to force systemic changes that will affect how the entire airline industry approaches customer relations." Crawford received an update from his operations team about the expanding impact of the fuel stoppage across Skyline's network. "Sir, we now have flight delays affecting over 20 cities with cascading cancellations that will continue for the rest of the day, even if fuel services are restored immediately." Crawford understood that Derek and Linda's discrimination against one family had triggered operational chaos affecting tens of thousands of travelers and costing his company millions of dollars in lost revenue, canceled bookings, and customer satisfaction recovery efforts. Arya watched as airport personnel prepared for Vincent's arrival, understanding that her father was demonstrating how corporate power could be used to protect dignity and demand accountability when institutional discrimination was disguised as standard business practices. "Mr. Crawford, my father could have accepted your apologies and moved on, but then other families would face the same treatment we received today." Zara continued monitoring social media where the hashtag #accountability_matters was trending globally as the story sparked conversations about discrimination, corporate responsibility, and the use of economic leverage to force social justice outcomes. "Mr. Crawford, this story is being shared by millions of people worldwide. Everyone is watching how corporate America responds to discrimination." Crawford felt the global attention focused on his company's response to institutional prejudice. Understanding that Skyline Airlines had become a test case for whether businesses would accept accountability for employee discrimination or attempt to minimize consequences through public relations management. Captain Walsh approached Crawford with news about Vincent's aircraft. "Sir, the Gulfstream has landed and is taxiing to the VIP terminal. Ground transportation is standing by to bring Mr. Beaumont to Terminal 4. Crawford realized that Vincent's personal involvement transformed the situation from a customer service recovery effort into a corporate negotiation between equals, with the CEO of Chimera Energy Group demanding systemic changes that would prevent future discrimination incidents. As the sound of approaching vehicles indicated Vincent's imminent arrival, Kai opened his journal to a fresh page and looked up at Crawford with the earnest expression that had been challenging adults throughout the entire confrontation. "Mr. Crawford, when my daddy gets here, are you going to apologize for what Mr. Derek and Miss Linda did to us?" Crawford felt the weight of corporate accountability as he realized that apologizing to Vincent Beaumont would be tantamount to admitting legal liability for discrimination while failing to apologize would demonstrate that Skyline Airlines lacked the moral courage to accept responsibility for employee behavior. The moment of ultimate reckoning was approaching, and everyone present understood that Vincent's arrival would determine whether corporate accountability for discrimination was possible in American business culture. 48 hours later, Arya, Zara, and Kai sat in the elegant conference room of their London hotel, the city's skyline visible through floor-to-ceiling windows as they processed the extraordinary events that had transformed a routine travel day into an international incident that was reshaping conversations about corporate accountability across multiple industries. Vincent had arrived at JFK as promised, and his reunion with his children had been captured by dozens of phones and broadcast to millions of viewers worldwide, showing the protective embrace of a father who had used corporate power to defend his family's dignity while simultaneously forcing an entire industry to confront its tolerance for institutional discrimination. Daddy Kai said, looking up from the journal where he had been documenting his thoughts about the airport confrontation, "Do you think Mr. Derek and Miss Linda understand now why what they did was wrong, or are they just sorry they got caught?" Vincent sat down beside his youngest son, recognizing that Kai's question touched on fundamental issues of justice redemption and the possibility for genuine transformation that extended far beyond individual punishment. "That's a very wise question, Kai. Sometimes people need to face consequences before they're willing to examine their own behavior and acknowledge the harm they've caused others." Arya pulled out her phone, where she had been monitoring the continued global coverage of their airport experience and its implications for corporate diversity training, federal anti-discrimination enforcement, and the use of economic leverage to force social justice outcomes. "The story is still spreading, Daddy. Business schools are already creating case studies about how you used Chimera's market position to demand accountability for discrimination." Zara had been reviewing the flood of messages from other travelers who had experienced similar treatment at airports, hotels, and retail establishments, sharing stories of discrimination that had been ignored or minimized because they lacked the economic leverage to force corporate accountability. "Hundreds of families have reached out to share their experiences with airline discrimination, Daddy. Most of them just had to accept the treatment and move on." Vincent felt the weight of privilege and responsibility as he realized that his family's ability to demand justice was exceptional, and that the vast majority of discrimination victims lacked the resources or influence to force institutional changes that would protect future travelers from similar treatment. "That's exactly why this incident was important," Vincent explained to his children. "We had the power to force accountability not just for our family, but for all the families who have been treated unfairly without any recourse for justice." The successful completion of their London business meetings had proceeded smoothly, with European energy investors expressing strong interest in Chimera's clean aviation fuel initiatives, but the conversations had been dominated by questions about the airport incident and its implications for corporate responsibility in customer relations. Kai raised his hand, drawing his family's attention with the gesture that had become his trademark during the airport confrontation. "Daddy, if we have the power to help other people, does that mean we have to use it even when it's hard or expensive?" Vincent smiled at his youngest son's intuitive understanding of the relationship between power and moral responsibility, recognizing that Kai had learned profound lessons about justice and accountability that would shape his character for the rest of his life. Kai, having power means having the ability to make choices that affect other people's lives, and with that ability comes the obligation to choose justice over convenience. Arya had been researching the aftermath of Derek and Linda's termination, discovering that both former employees were facing significant financial hardship, industry, blacklisting, and family stress as a result of their discriminatory behavior and the consequences that followed. Daddy Derek and Linda are both struggling now. Derek's wife had to take a second job, and Linda might lose her house. Vincent considered his daughter's implicit question about mercy, understanding that justice required accountability, but not necessarily the complete destruction of people who had made terrible decisions based on prejudiced assumptions. Arya, consequences for harmful behavior are necessary to prevent future harm, but redemption is possible for people who genuinely acknowledge their mistakes and commit to changing their behavior. Zara looked up from her laptop where she had been researching rehabilitation programs that helped people overcome unconscious bias and develop more equitable approaches to customer service and human interactions. There are organizations that specialize in helping people like Derek and Linda understand the impact of their behavior and develop better ways of treating others. Vincent felt pride in his daughter's mature consideration of complex justice issues that balanced accountability with the possibility of redemption, understanding that they were developing the moral sophistication that would make them effective leaders in whatever fields they chose to pursue. Perhaps Vincent said thoughtfully, "There's an opportunity to transform this incident into something that helps Derek and Linda become advocates for the kind of treatment they denied our family." Kai opened his journal to a fresh page and began writing, his young handwriting careful and deliberate, as he documented his family's discussion about justice, mercy, and the possibility of turning enemies into allies through understanding rather than punishment. The London meetings had been successful, but the real transformation had occurred during their airport experience, where individual discrimination had collided with corporate power and created an opportunity for systemic change that would affect thousands of future travelers. 3 weeks later, the Beaumont family's return flight to New York took place on British Airways, a deliberate choice that sent a clear message about the ongoing consequences of Skyline Airlines' tolerance for discrimination, while creating an opportunity to observe how other carriers approached customer service after the global attention focused on airport bias. Vincent had spent the weeks in London not just completing business negotiations, but working with civil rights organizations, corporate diversity consultants, and federal transportation officials to develop comprehensive reforms that would address institutional discrimination throughout the airline industry, rather than simply punishing individual employees. Daddy Kai said as their aircraft began its descent toward JFK, "Are we going to see Mr. Derek and Miss Linda when we get back to New York? I've been thinking about what we talked about in London about helping people learn instead of just punishing them." Vincent looked at his youngest son with the pride that came from watching a child develop sophisticated thinking about complex moral issues that many adults struggled to navigate effectively. Kai: "I've been having conversations with people who specialize in helping individuals overcome unconscious bias and develop more equitable approaches to treating others." Arya had been coordinating with federal investigators who were conducting a comprehensive review of discrimination complaints across the airline industry, using the Beaumont incident as a catalyst for examining patterns of biased treatment that had been ignored or minimized by corporate management. The Department of Transportation is implementing new requirements for bias training and discrimination reporting that will affect every airline in the country. Daddy: Zara had been working with civil rights organizations to develop a framework for corporate accountability that balanced individual consequences with opportunities for education and redemption, understanding that lasting change required transformation rather than simple punishment. There's a program that helps people like Derek and Linda understand the impact of their behavior and develop skills for treating all customers with dignity and respect. Vincent felt satisfaction in his children's mature approach to justice issues, recognizing that they had learned to think about accountability in ways that promoted positive change rather than simply satisfying desires for revenge or retribution. As their flight landed at JFK, the family was met by airport personnel who provided respectful professional service that demonstrated how customer relations should function when employees were properly trained and supervised in anti-discrimination policies and practices. 2 days later, Vincent arranged a meeting at Chimera Energy Group's headquarters with Derek Walsh and Linda Morrison, both of whom had requested the opportunity to apologize personally to the family they had treated so poorly and to explore possibilities for redemption that might restore some meaning to their lives. Derek entered the conference room looking substantially different from the arrogant duty manager who had canceled legitimate reservations 3 weeks earlier, his appearance showing the stress and reflection that came from losing everything he had worked to achieve while being forced to confront the reality of his discriminatory behavior. "Mr. Beaumont Derek," said his voice carrying genuine humility for the first time since the airport incident. "I want to apologize to you and your children for the inexcusable way I treated them. I was wrong. My behavior was discriminatory, and I accept full responsibility for the consequences." Linda sat beside Derek, her 22 years of airline experience replaced by the wisdom that came from losing everything due to prejudiced assumptions and the determination to ensure that her mistakes could serve some constructive purpose in preventing future discrimination. "Mr. Beaumont Ariazara," Linda said, her voice steady despite the emotional weight of the moment. "I treated your family terribly because I made assumptions based on appearance rather than character. I want to dedicate whatever time I have left to making sure no other family experiences what I put yours through." Kai looked up from his journal, where he had been preparing questions for this meeting based on his continued thinking about justice, accountability, and the possibility of transformation. "Mr. Derek, Miss Linda, when you were being mean to us at the airport, did you know you were being mean, or did you think you were doing the right thing?" Derek felt the devastating honesty of Kai's question, understanding that the child was asking him to confront the self-deception that had allowed him to justify discriminatory behavior as professional security procedures. "Kai, I convinced myself that I was following proper procedures, but the truth is that I treated your family differently because of how you looked, and that was wrong, regardless of what I told myself." Linda nodded in agreement with Derek's acknowledgement, recognizing that honest self-examination was essential for genuine redemption. "Kai, I was scared of making mistakes, and instead of checking facts, I relied on assumptions that hurt innocent people. I'm sorry for the pain I caused your family." Vincent watched Derek and Linda's responses to his son's questions, evaluating their sincerity and their potential for becoming advocates for the dignified treatment they had failed to provide to his family. "Derek, Linda, Vincent said Chimera Energy Group is partnering with civil rights organizations to develop comprehensive bias training programs for customer service industries. If you're genuinely committed to change, there may be opportunities for you to help other people avoid the mistakes you made." 6 months after the airport incident that had grounded hundreds of flights and cost millions of dollars, Vincent Beaumont stood at the podium of the National Transportation Forum, addressing an audience of airline executives, federal regulators, and civil rights leaders who had gathered to discuss the institutional changes that were transforming how the aviation industry approached customer dignity and anti-discrimination training. "Ladies and gentlemen," Vincent began, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had used corporate power to force accountability for discrimination. "The incident involving my family at JFK demonstrated how quickly individual prejudice can escalate into industry-wide crisis when businesses fail to train employees properly and hold them accountable for discriminatory behavior." Behind Vincent, a large screen displayed statistics showing the dramatic reduction in airline discrimination complaints that had occurred since federal authorities implemented mandatory bias training requirements and established independent ombudsman offices for investigating customer treatment issues. In the audience, Derek Walsh and Linda Morrison sat together, both wearing the identification badges of newly certified bias training specialists who had spent the past 6 months working with civil rights organizations to develop educational programs that helped customer service employees recognize and overcome unconscious prejudices. Derek had initially resisted Vincent's offer to participate in redemption-focused training, but the complete destruction of his career prospects in the airline industry had forced him to confront the choice between permanent failure and the difficult work of genuine transformation. Linda had embraced the opportunity more quickly, recognizing that her 22 years of industry experience could be valuable in helping other employees avoid the mistakes that had cost her everything she had worked to achieve in her professional career. Mr. Beaumont, Linda said during the question and answer session following Vincent's presentation, "I want to publicly acknowledge that the training program you sponsored saved my life by giving me the opportunity to transform my shame into service. I'm now working with airlines across the country to implement customer dignity protocols." Derek stood beside Linda, his transformation from arrogant manager to humble educator, representing the kind of personal growth that was possible when consequences were combined with opportunities for redemption. "Mr. Beaumont, your family taught me that treating customers with respect isn't just morally right, it's essential for business success. I'm grateful for the chance to help other employees learn that lesson without destroying their careers." Vincent felt satisfaction in Derek and Linda's genuine transformation. Understanding that accountability without redemption was merely punishment, while accountability combined with education created the possibility for positive change that benefited everyone involved. Ariazara and Kai sat in the front row of the auditorium, watching their father address the industry-wide changes that had resulted from their airport experience and feeling pride in the knowledge that their difficult day had created protections for thousands of future travelers. Daddy Kai whispered during a break in the proceedings, "Do you think Mr. Derek and Miss Linda are really different now, or are they just pretending to be nice because they got in trouble?" Vincent smiled at his son's continued focus on the authenticity of transformation, recognizing that Kai's questions had been driving the family's approach to justice throughout the entire process. "Kai, genuine change takes time to prove. But I believe Derek and Linda are working hard to become better people than they were when they treated us badly." The forum concluded with the announcement of new federal requirements for airline bias training, customer dignity, ombudsman positions, and transparent reporting of discrimination complaints that would create industry-wide accountability for the equitable treatment of all passengers. Captain Walsh, who had witnessed the original incident and participated in Skyline Airlines' comprehensive reform process, approached the Beaumont family after Vincent's presentation. "Mr. Beaumont, I want you to know that every pilot and flight attendant in our company has completed bias training based on what happened to your family. We're committed to ensuring that no passenger ever experiences discrimination on our aircraft." Vincent appreciated Captain Walsh's acknowledgement while recognizing that lasting change required ongoing vigilance rather than one-time training programs. Captain Walsh, cultural transformation is a continuous process, not a single event. The real test will be how your industry maintains these standards over time. As the family left the forum, Kai opened his journal to document his observations about the day's presentations and discussions, understanding that he had witnessed the completion of a process that began with discrimination and evolved into industry-wide transformation through accountability education and the possibility of redemption. 1 year after the incident that had transformed airline industry practices and demonstrated how corporate power could be used to demand accountability for discrimination. The Beaumont family found themselves back at JFK Terminal 4, but this time as honored guests at the dedication of the Beaumont Customer Dignity Center, a training facility funded by Chimera Energy Group and operated by federal transportation authorities. The center would serve as a model for anti-discrimination training throughout the aviation industry, with Derek Walsh and Linda Morrison as lead instructors, helping customer service employees recognize unconscious bias and develop equitable approaches to treating all passengers with dignity and respect. Daddy Kai said as they approached the familiar first-class check-in area where their confrontation had begun exactly 12 months earlier. "It's strange being back here, but it feels different now. Do you think the people who work here remember what happened to us?" Vincent looked around the terminal, noting the new customer dignity protocols that were posted prominently throughout the check-in areas, and the diverse staff who had been hired and trained according to standards that emerged from his family's experience with institutional discrimination. Kai: "I think people remember, and I hope they've learned that treating customers with respect is essential for business success," Vincent replied, observing the professional, courteous service that travelers were receiving regardless of their appearance, age, or apparent economic status. Arya and Zara had returned to JFK not as passengers, but as business leaders who were speaking at the dedication ceremony about the importance of corporate accountability and the responsibility that comes with economic power and social influence. "Ladies and gentlemen," Arya said during her remarks to an audience that included airline executives, federal officials, and civil rights leaders. "What happened to our family was wrong, but it became an opportunity to create changes that protect thousands of other families from experiencing discrimination when they travel." Zara followed her sister's presentation with analysis of the measurable improvements in customer satisfaction and discrimination complaint reduction that had occurred since mandatory bias training and accountability measures were implemented across the airline industry. Derek Walsh stood at the front of the training center's main classroom wearing an instructor's badge and preparing to lead his afternoon session on recognizing and overcoming unconscious bias in customer service interactions. His personal transformation from discriminatory manager to anti-bias educator, representing the possibility of redemption through accountability and education. Class today, we're going to examine a real case study involving a family who was treated poorly because employees made assumptions based on appearance, rather than following professional procedures. Derek said, his voice carrying the humility that came from personal experience with the consequences of prejudiced behavior. Linda Morrison worked beside Derek, her 22 years of airline experience, now focused on helping new employees understand that customer dignity was not optional but essential for both moral and business success. The most important lesson from this case, Linda told her trainees, is that treating any customer badly reflects poorly on the entire company and can have consequences that extend far beyond individual interactions. During the ceremony's conclusion, Kai was invited to speak about his experience and his perspective on justice, accountability, and the possibility for positive change when people were willing to learn from their mistakes. "Hi, everyone," Kai said, his small stature requiring a step stool to reach the podium microphone. "My name is Kai Beaumont, and a year ago, some people at this airport were mean to my family because they thought we didn't belong in first class." The audience listened with complete attention as Kai continued his remarks with the moral clarity that had challenged adults throughout the entire incident. "But my daddy taught me that when people do wrong things, we should help them learn to do better things instead of just punishing them forever. Mr. Derek and Miss Linda are here now teaching other people how to be nice to all customers, and I think that's better than just being mad at them." Kai's words captured the essence of restorative justice that had guided the Beaumont family's approach to the discrimination they had experienced, demonstrating that accountability could coexist with redemption when people were genuinely committed to change. Vincent felt overwhelming pride in his youngest son's wisdom and in the institutional changes that had emerged from their family's refusal to accept discriminatory treatment as inevitable or acceptable. As the ceremony concluded and the family prepared to board their flight to London, this time on Skyline Airlines, which had earned the opportunity to restore their business relationship through comprehensive reforms and demonstrated commitment to customer dignity, Kai opened his journal one final time to document his observations. Today I learned that bad things can become good things when people work together to fix problems instead of just being angry about them. Kai wrote, Mr. Derek and Miss Linda hurt our feelings, but now they help other people learn how to treat everyone nicely. I think that's what justice really means. The story had come full circle with discrimination transformed into education, corporate crisis converted into industry reform, and individual redemption, emerging from institutional accountability that protected future families from experiencing the treatment the Beaumonts had endured and overcome. 6 months later, Derek leads bias training sessions across the aviation industry, sharing his story of prejudice and redemption with thousands of customer service employees. Linda manages the Customer Dignity Program at a consortium of airlines, personally training every agent in respectful treatment protocols. Both have rebuilt their lives through service, not punishment. Kai's journal became the foundation for the Children's Guide to Fair Treatment, now used in diversity training programs worldwide. His simple questions, why were you scared of us, and what would fairness look like, became the standard for examining bias in corporate America. The Beaumont family learned that true power lies not in crushing enemies, but in transforming them into allies. As Vincent told a congressional hearing on transportation equity, we could have destroyed 2 lives that day. Instead, we chose to change an entire industry. That's the difference between revenge and justice. What would you do if you witnessed discrimination? Like what happened to the Beaumont family? Would you speak up immediately, stay silent, or something in between? Leave a comment with your thoughts. If this story moved you, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories about people fighting injustice. Share this video if you believe more companies need to be held accountable for how they treat all customers. Thank you for watching, and remember, sometimes the most powerful act of courage is simply refusing to accept that discrimination is normal. One family's dignity can spark transformation that affects millions.